The first sign was often nothing at all, just a pale patch on the skin, the kind a Londoner might blame on winter light or cheap soap. But in the narrow rooms of the city, beneath gas lamps that flickered like nervous hearts, whispers spread faster than symptoms. Leprosy. The word moved through the capital like a cold draft under a door. Soft at first, then sharp, then impossible to ignore. Physicians pretended calm, churches preached caution, and families closed their curtains a little earlier than usual, as if darkness could keep contagion at bay. In those years, disease drifted through London the way ether drifted through a surgery, sweet, strange, and ruinous. No one knew where the next case would appear. A laundress in Stepney whose hands began to lose their feeling, a dressmaker in Holborn whose fingertips turned white like chalk, a dockworker on the Thames whose skin refused to heal. Panic followed them quietly, politely, with the courtesy of a Victorian shadow. And in an age obsessed with progress and perfection, the thought of an ancient, disfiguring illness returning to the heart of the empire felt like a crack in the very foundation of British pride. Stay with me tonight. There are more lamplit corridors to walk, more truths hidden beneath the city's powdered respectability. Subscribe and tell me, where are you listening from? It began, as so many Victorian horrors did, with something deceptively small, a pale patch no bigger than a thumbprint appearing on the inside of a laundress's wrist, one damp February morning. She noticed it while scrubbing the gentleman's collar, her hands already reddened by lye, steam rising around her like a faint ghost. At first, she thought little of it. London's winter light bleached everything. Soap stripped the skin raw, and the work of the poor always left its mark. Yet, this patch was different. It sat there quietly, stubbornly, refusing to sting or throb or fade the way irritation usually did. It was just still, frozen, almost serene. In the tenement room she shared with two widows, the air smelling of boiled cabbage and coal dust, she held her wrist nearer to the oil lamp. The skin looked strangely smooth, as if polished by unseen hands. She rubbed it hard. It didn't redden, it didn't warm, it didn't feel like her skin at all. More unsettling still, she felt nothing beneath her own fingertips, a sensation like touching paper. Outside, London exhaled a long, fog-heavy breath against the window pane. Footsteps echoed along the alley. The city's heartbeat remained steady, indifferent, but inside that cramped room, dread settled over her like a damp wool shawl. She pulled down her sleeve and said nothing. The poor had no room for worry. Worry cost money. Worry cost time. Worry drew eyes. And eyes, especially the eyes of landlords, foremen, and charitable ladies, could ruin a woman's tenuous place in the world. By the end of the week, 2 more patches had appeared. One on the upper arm, one near the shoulder, each one pale, cool, calm as frost on glass. She worked slower, hiding her hands in steam clouds, keeping to the back of the laundry where the matron's gaze rarely wandered. Still, the change was impossible to ignore. She could feel the shape of her life shifting, like cobblestones becoming uneven beneath her feet. In the afternoons, when the laundry's great iron boilers hissed like angry beasts and scented vapor wrapped itself around her, she found herself staring at the other women, watching their hands, their faces, their movements, looking for signs. If they noticed her silence, they said nothing. Silence was common among London's poor. It softened hunger, disguised fear, and hid the illnesses no doctor would treat for free. But one evening, the matron, a sharp-boned woman who smelled faintly of carbolic, caught her wrist as she reached for a fresh sheet. The grip was firm, professional, the way nurses grasp patients who are about to faint. "Hold," the matron murmured. "Let me see that." Her eyes narrowed. Her thumb brushed the pale patch. When the laundress failed to react, failed even to flinch, the matron's expression changed in a way the laundress had never seen. Not anger, not disgust, but recognition like someone spotting a familiar shadow on a familiar street. "You must go to the infirmary," the matron whispered, her voice suddenly softened by something that felt like pity. "Tonight. Don't wait." The laundress tried to protest, but her words faltered in her throat. The matron released her wrist with the gentleness of someone laying down something fragile, something already broken. Outside, London's fog deepened, swallowing the gas lamps until they glowed like sinking stars. The laundress stepped into the cold, her sleeve pulled tight, her breath sharp in her chest. Each footstep felt heavier than the last. She knew, without understanding how, that the city had begun to turn toward her, not with curiosity, not with sympathy, but with fear. And in that moment, walking alone through the muffled streets, the distant bells tolling as if counting her remaining certainties, she realized that whatever lived beneath her skin had already begun its quiet work. London, for the first time in centuries, had reason to tremble. The rumour began the way all Victorian rumours preferred to travel softly, delicately, slipping between words like perfume drifting between lace gloves. A whisper here, a murmur there, carried along the narrow veins of the city until it reached places far more polished than the Stepney laundry room where the laundress first noticed her pale patches. It reached taverns first, because taverns are always where fear warms its hands before wandering out into the world. On a rain-streaked evening, beneath the amber haze of gas lamps along Bishopsgate, two carriage drivers stood in the shelter of a pub awning. Their horses steamed beside them, heads bowed patiently against the damp. One driver leaned in close, lowering his voice as if the fog itself were listening. "Another case," he muttered. "Saw an inspector shut an entire lodging house this morning. Didn't say why. But the tenants left, quiet-like." He paused. Too quiet. The other laughed to mask the unease settling into his bones. "Could have been typhus." Typhus doesn't make a man's hands turn white as paper. That line, white as paper, slipped into the fog and travelled with it, across streets, under lamps, through crowds. By the time the fog reached Holborn, the phrase had changed, as rumours always do. Now it was white as candle wax, which was worse somehow too still, too deliberate, too much like flesh surrendering to something unearthly. In shops, customers asked questions they pretended were harmless. In parlours, ladies whispered behind feathered fans, glancing nervously at the maids who poured their tea. A sense of something old, older than factories, older than railways, older even than London, seemed to lift its head again, as if waking from a long sleep. It was the sort of fear that came with a scent, coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint medicinal sting of carbolic acid drifting from hospital windows. London carried its anxiety beneath its elegant exterior like a hidden pulse. At the Royal Exchange, a clerk overheard a merchant speak of a woman dismissed from her position for a strange affliction. At Covent Garden, a flower seller swore a customer wore gloves in July to hide fingers that looked not quite attached. Every telling grew more ornate, more alarming, until the city's imagination swelled into something monstrous. Doctors, meanwhile, walked with a certain stiffness, like men trying not to be recognized in their own city. They knew too much and said too little. The word they avoided had not been spoken aloud in England for generations. It was a word belonging to medieval chronicles, not modern medical journals. A word that had haunted monasteries, not rail stations. A word that made even hardened physicians swallow hard before turning the page. Leprosy. But they would not say it. Not yet. Not while they still hoped they were wrong. Still, the signs grew. An omnibus conductor noticed a regular passenger clutching the rail with bandaged hands. A bookseller in Bloomsbury wondered why a young gentleman suddenly stopped coming in for his weekly purchases. And on a fog-heavy night near the Strand, a constable found a woman weeping beneath a lamp-post, her gloves torn, her skin beneath pale and oddly smooth. "What's happened to you, miss?" he asked. She simply shook her head and whispered, Don't touch me. The words struck him harder than any blow could. In a city where thousands brushed past each other every hour, the idea of untouchability was a violence of its own. By the end of the week, whispers swirled around the city like ether drifting through a surgery, sweet, chemical, dangerous, promising relief while quietly stealing breath. People spoke of the patches, the numbness, the curse from the alley, the Stepney sickness, and the chalk hands. Not one dared call it by its true name. But the fear had already learned it. And London, restless beneath its lamps and fog, was beginning to understand that the most terrible things often arrive quietly on a whisper, on a breath, on a pale patch of skin that feels like nothing at all. Dr. Jonathan Hargreaves prided himself on being a man of rational mind, a surgeon of respectable standing, with clean cuffs, steady hands, and a manner that reassured anxious patients long before he spoke. But on the morning the laundress from Stepney appeared in his surgery, he felt something tighten inside his chest, a small spool of dread twisting itself closed. She stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand, shivering slightly despite the warmth from the coal stove. Her sleeves were tugged low, yet he could see the edge of a pale blotch on her wrist as she tried to hide it. Her eyes avoided his, fixed instead on the polished floorboards. Dr. Hargreaves noted this with professional speed. Shame always came first. That frightened him more than the mark itself. "Show me," he said gently. Her fingers trembled as she pulled back her sleeve. The skin revealed was smooth, too smooth like worn ivory. There was no redness, no irritation, no sign of life beneath the surface. He pressed lightly with the blunt end of his penknife. "Do you feel that?" She swallowed. "No, sir." He pressed harder. "And that?" Still nothing. Something cold slid down his spine. Not fear, not yet, but memory. An old illustration from a medical textbook he had once skimmed late at night, when he was a young physician and the world felt safe. The drawing had been crude, a hand marked with patches like fading scars. The accompanying description was brief and clinical, but it carried a faint horror he recognized now in the pit of his stomach. He cleared his throat. "How long have you had these marks?" "A fortnight, sir." "And they do not hurt? Burn? Itch?" "No, sir. They feel absent." Absent. It was the perfect word, and the worst one. He forced his expression to remain composed, though his pulse hammered a clouded drumbeat beneath his waistcoat. In the corner of the room, the ether bottle gleamed softly, catching a ribbon of morning light. Its sweet, chemical scent always lingered faintly in the air, a reminder of the thin line between easing pain and silencing breath. Today, that same sweetness seemed heavier, cloying, as if it had seeped into the air from some other source, something older, something unwelcome. Dr. Hargreaves turned abruptly to his ledger, searching for a plausible explanation. Eczema, frostbite, a reaction to soap, something mild, modern, respectable. Anything but the truth forming in the back of his mind like a patient knocking on a locked door. But the pattern was too precise, too pale, too numb, too familiar. He set down his pen. His hand shook. "Doctor," she whispered. He forced himself to meet her eyes, and in them he saw a quiet desperation no medical instrument could measure. She was not asking for a diagnosis. She was asking for permission to be unafraid. He could not give it. "You must go to the infirmary," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "They will examine you more thoroughly than I can here." "But will I be cured?" Her voice cracked like thin ice. He hesitated. A long, unforgivable hesitation. The gas lamp flickered overhead. Outside, carriage wheels hissed through the wet street, the city moving with its usual indifference. And in that moment, between the lamp's sputter and the carriage's fading rattle, he knew he would not say the word. Not today. Not yet. "I believe." He steadied his breath. "I believe they will know what to do." A lie, wrapped delicately in professional tone. She thanked him. She even tried to smile. Then she pulled her sleeve down, gathered her worn shawl, and stepped back into the fog, becoming one more shadow swallowed by London's endless appetite. Dr. Hargreaves remained still long after she left, staring at the closed door. He knew what he had seen, he knew what it meant, but to acknowledge it aloud would bring the medieval world roaring back into the heart of industrial London. So he did the one thing his training forbade. He looked away, and as he extinguished the gas lamp above his desk, he realized with a crushing certainty that the city was entering a darkness he could not cure. The laundress left Dr. Hargreaves' surgery with the same quiet steps she had entered, though the weight inside her chest had grown heavier, denser, like a stone wrapped in damp cloth. The fog pressed close as she walked, soft and cold against her cheeks, swallowing sound until even the clatter of carriage wheels seemed far away. Stepney always smelled of river water and coal smoke, but today an additional scent clung to the air, a trace of something medicinal drifting from her sleeves. She wondered if others could smell her fear. In the laundry house, where kettles roared like iron beasts and steam rose in suffocating clouds, the matron watched her with narrowed eyes. It was not unkindness, it was knowledge. Knowledge of something the laundress did not yet understand. The other women worked quickly, rhythmically wringing, folding, beating grime from linen with wooden paddles that thudded like muffled drums. But each time the laundress moved, someone stepped slightly aside, subtly shifting away as if her presence were edged with cold. No one commented on her lateness, no one asked if she was well. Such questions were luxuries reserved for households with carpets and drawing rooms. Here, illness was a private debt paid in silence. She slipped past them, carrying a crate of damp shirts that seemed heavier than usual. Her hands, those strange, half-numb hands, did not grip as they once had. Twice she nearly dropped the crate. The second time, a shirt brushed the floor. Another laundress snatched it up and retreated without a word. The laundress felt heat rise to her face, embarrassment or shame. She couldn't tell. She dipped her hands into the wash basin, hoping the scalding water might bring sensation back, but it only steamed around her fingers, indifferent. She could see the water shimmer. She could see her skin submerged beneath it. Yet she felt nothing, not the heat, not the sting, not the world. As the hours dragged on, she caught glimpses of the matron in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression tight. When the laundress finally paused to rest, the matron approached, her boots creaking on the damp floor. "You saw the doctor?" the matron asked quietly. "Yes," the laundress murmured. "He said the infirmary. They would know." The matron's eyes flicked to the marks on her wrists. "Did he say what it is?" "No," the laundress whispered. "He didn't name it." The matron's expression softened with a sorrow more eloquent than pity. "Then he suspects," she said softly, "even if he will not speak it aloud." The laundress felt the room sway around her. Steam, heat, sweat, and the throb of her own heartbeat merging into a dizzying blur. "Is it contagious?" she asked, though she feared the answer. The matron hesitated before speaking, and in that hesitation lived centuries of dread. Some say yes, some say no, but fear moves faster than truth, girl, faster than illness. Once a rumor catches, it spreads quicker than sickness ever could. The laundress bowed her head. She already knew. The other women no longer brushed past her. They kept their distance even in the cramped space, moving around her as though she stood inside a circle only they could see. At dusk, when work ended and the steam drifted upward like surrendered breath, the matron took her aside. "Go home, but not here tomorrow. Take your things, and go before the others see." Her voice trembled despite her authority. "I won't have them turning on you." The laundress collected her small bundle, a skirt, a shawl, a tin cup, 2 worn books left by a previous tenant, and stepped out into the evening fog. The ache in her chest tightened. She had lost her job, that much was clear. But worse than losing work was losing the world She knew its routine, its certainties, its familiarity. And as she walked through Stepney's narrow lanes, every shadow seemed to stare, every lamplit window seemed to watch. Children paused mid-play. Dogs retreated instinctively. Even the fog seemed to pull back slightly as she passed. Word moved fast here. She could feel it moving now, slipping into doorways, through cracks, into the ears of neighbors perched at windows. By the time she reached her lodging house, she knew without being told that someone else had already whispered her name. And behind that whisper, London's fear was beginning to gather momentum. The infirmary where the laundress was sent stood on a narrow street near Mile End, its windows tall and thin, its walls the colour of dried bone. At night, when the city's fog thickened like wet wool, the buildings seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the gleam of candlelight flickering behind glass panes. It was a place Londoners passed quickly, even in daylight. Too many secrets lingered beneath its eaves. Dr. Lionel Fenwick, the surgeon on evening duty, was a man etched by sleeplessness. His face carried the faint, quivering hollows of someone who had seen illnesses that did not belong to the modern age, and who feared they might be returning. He sat bent over his desk, the candle beside him burning low and slow, its flame leaning like a weary sentinel. Medical charts lay scattered across the wood surface, diagrams of nerve pathways, skin lesions, notes written in cramped Latin. His spectacles rested near the inkpot, forgotten for the moment as he pressed his fingers to his temple. It was almost closing hour when the laundress arrived. The attendant led her into Fenwick's office with the same quiet efficiency one uses to carry something fragile and possibly explosive. Dr. Fenwick looked up, weary but attentive. He noticed immediately the way she held her hands tucked close to her body, as though shielding the rest of the world from them. "Sit, please," he murmured. She perched on the edge of the chair, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. When she rolled up her sleeve at his request, the candlelight caught the pale blotches on her arm, smooth islands of skin drained of all warmth, all colour, all life. Fenwick inhaled sharply, though he disguised the sound as a thoughtful hum. He moved closer, the hem of his coat brushing the floor. The room smelled faintly of ether, old books, and the metallic sweetness of antiseptic. He lifted one of her hands gently, turning it under the warm glow. Her skin reflected the candlelight like polished wax. "Do you feel this?" he asked as he tapped her wrist. "No, sir." "And this?" "Nothing." Her voice trembled. The honesty in it struck him harder than any symptom. Fenwick reached for his lamp, a small brass device with a magnifying lens, and adjusted the wick until the flame sharpened into a steady glow. The light illuminated the mottled pattern racing across her skin, spreading like frost on a window pane in winter. His heart tightened. There it was. The unmistakable map of a disease London had not spoken of for centuries. "Have you been near anyone else with these markings?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not that I know." He hesitated. "Has anyone avoided you? Stepped away?" Another pause. "Has anyone remarked on a scent? Something strange?" Her eyes widened with shame. "Yes. One woman said I smelled like disinfectant, but I haven't used any." Fenwick exhaled slowly, the breath trembling. That faint odor, sharp, faintly sweet, almost sterile, was a detail he remembered only from old case notes. It was a scent no cologne or flower could mask. He stepped back, pacing once before stopping at the far side of the desk. His hand rested on a thick medical volume whose spine was cracked from years of anxious reference. "I will not alarm you," he said quietly, "but these signs, they are not ordinary. They are not common." "Can it be cured?" she whispered. He closed his eyes for a moment, a heavy, resigned moment, and when he opened them, the candle's flame reflected in them with a mournful brightness. "There are treatments," he said carefully, "but cures are elusive. We will do everything we can. You are not alone in this." It was the closest he could come to the truth without saying the word that hovered unspoken in the air like a ghost. Leprosy. He could not speak it, not yet. The walls would hear, and if the walls heard, London would hear. Then nothing would contain the panic. Fenwick drew a curtain around her chair and began writing in his ledger slow strokes of ink that would seal her fate more surely than any symptom. He wrote not a diagnosis but a description cloaked in Latin terminology and ambiguity. Outside the infirmary, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, eager to slip inside and listen. Inside, the candle gutters, then steadies. Dr. Fenwick closes his ledger, and with a final, weary look at the laundress, small, trembling, and unknowingly standing at the threshold of London's coming terror, he extinguishes the lamp. A soft puff, a curl of smoke, and a darkness that feels older than the city itself. The ward lay at the far end of the infirmary, past a series of corridors where footsteps echoed too sharply and the air grew colder with every turn. The laundress followed the attendant through each dim passage, her palms damp despite the numbness creeping across them. She felt as though she were being guided deeper into the city's throat, swallowed, in silence, by medical corridors that held their own memories. When they reached the final door, the attendant hesitated before opening it. That hesitation, brief but unmistakable, was more frightening than anything the laundress had seen so far. It was a warning disguised as courtesy. The door creaked. The scent hit her first. Carbolic acid. Sharp, clean, and overwhelming, so strong it burned faintly at the back of her throat. The laundress had smelled carbolic before in diluted forms, in laundry drains, at the public baths, on the hands of a doctor. But here it was different. Here it was not a cleanser. It was a boundary, a barrier, a declaration that whatever lay inside this room required something stronger than soap, stronger than prayer, stronger even than hope. The ward was long and narrow, lit by a row of low-hanging lamps whose glow was the color of weak tea. Beds were arranged in 2 lines, each one separated by a thin curtain that created the illusion of privacy, but concealed nothing of the hushed breathing, the restless shifting, the muted coughs. A nurse stepped forward, a tall woman with dark hair, pulled tight beneath her cap, and a face carved into an expression of practiced calm. She looked at the laundress the way one might look at a flickering flame, with wary respect. "Your name?" the nurse asked softly. The laundress answered. "And your occupation?" "Laundry work, miss." The nurse nodded and made a small mark on her clipboard. Then she led the laundress to a narrow bed near the window. The sheets were crisp and cold, smelling faintly of starch beneath the oppressive carbolic. "Rest here," the nurse said. "The surgeon will see you again shortly." But the laundress could feel eyes on her. From the neighboring bed, a woman with a bandage across her cheek watched through half-lowered lids. The bandage was stained yellow at the edges, and the exposed portion of her face looked unnaturally smooth, as though someone had erased its texture. On the other side, an old man leaned forward slightly, his hands folded, his palms showing mottled pale marks like spilled milk. The laundress lowered her gaze. She understood now. Everyone in this ward shared the same quiet affliction, the same secret that no doctor would say aloud and no patient wanted to accept. A room of pale patches and numb fingertips. A room where even breathing seemed subdued, as though the air itself feared contact. A room separated from the rest of London by a corridor of silence and carbolic fumes. Outside, the rain tapped against the pane like impatient fingers. Inside, the air hung still. A pair of doctors passed the ward entrance, speaking in low voices. Only a few words reached her, but they were enough. "Spread. Pattern is distinct. We must be discreet. Old cases. Resurfacing." The laundress felt her throat tighten. Old cases. Resurfacing. Words that belonged to stories whispered around hearths, not the modern, gleaming world of London's hospitals. She tried to calm herself by watching the patterns of lamplight shift across the ceiling. The golden glow trembled with each draft, bending like the flame of an ether lamp during an operation. She wondered what the city outside was doing at this very moment, whether the market still bustled, whether the tenements still clattered with pots and laughter, whether anyone noticed she had vanished from her small corner of the world. She doubted it. Fear has a way of muting the absence of the afflicted. A nurse drew the curtain halfway around her bed, not fully, never fully, and placed a folded gown beside her. "Change when you can," the nurse murmured, gentler now. "We'll bring something warm to drink." The laundress nodded, though her limbs felt heavy, her chest tight. She looked down at her hands, those pale, unfeeling hands, and suddenly they felt like strangers, parts of her body that no longer belonged to her. The ward hummed with quiet suffering. The scent of carbolic thickened as the lamps burned lower, and as the laundress lay back against the thin pillow, listening to the whispering breaths around her, she realized something chilling. Whatever had claimed her skin had also claimed this room. It lived here between the beds, in the air, in the silence. And London had no idea how close it was. No idea at all. The bell of St. Bartholomew's had always been known for its warm, full tone, a sound that rolled through the neighborhood like a gentle summons. But in recent weeks the bell had taken on a different character. It rang more often, and each time it did, the note trembled as if uncertain of its own purpose. Some said it was the cold affecting the metal. Others claimed the bell rope had frayed. But a few, the older ones, whispered something else entirely. The clergyman is ringing warnings again. Reverend Amos Whitcomb was a thin man with pale eyes and a stiff gait, a man who seemed carved from candle wax that had cooled before it found its shape. He had a quiet, deliberate way of speaking, and he never raised his voice, not even during sermons. Yet he rang the church bell with an intensity that startled the parish. He rang it at unusual hours. At dawn, when the fog clung low over the cobblestones. At dusk, when the gas lamps hissed awake. At midnight, when the parishioners stirred uneasily in their beds. The people of Clerkenwell began counting the rings. 6 at dawn, 8 at dusk, 12, always 12 at midnight. It was not a call to worship. It was a call to attention. Reverend Whitcomb had seen something. Inside the vicarage, the Reverend kept a journal with cramped handwriting crowding each page. He wrote of parish visits, whispered confessions, and troubling encounters. He wrote of a young mother with numb fingertips who insisted she had burned herself on a stovepipe, though there was no blister, no bruise. He wrote of a butcher's apprentice whose cheek bore a pale patch he tried to hide beneath soot. He wrote of the laundress from Stepney, the rumour of her illness reaching him long before any official report. And he wrote of fear, not his own, the city's. The Reverend had lived through epidemics of cholera, waves of smallpox, and winters where cold itself was the enemy. But this, whatever it was, felt different. It was not loud. It did not sweep through the streets with screaming or feverish delirium. It did not leave children gasping or men delirious. It crept, softly, politely, like a guest entering a parlour. A few days after the laundress was taken to the infirmary, the Reverend received a visit. A father and his teenage daughter, both pale as linen. The father admitted nothing. The girl said even less. But when she pushed back her sleeve to adjust her glove, Whitcomb saw it a patch, smooth as polished ivory, blooming near her elbow. He felt the bell rope call to him. After they left, he sat in his study, hands shaking, the afternoon light turning the dust motes into drifting ghosts. He opened his journal to a new page and wrote only one sentence. It returns. That evening, he walked to the church alone. The nave was quiet, smelling faintly of damp stone and extinguished candles. Whitcomb made his way up the narrow tower steps, the bell rope hanging like a stiff, skeletal vine from the ceiling above. He wrapped his hand around it. He hesitated. Then he pulled. The bell let out a deep, trembling cry that rolled across the parish like a warning whispered into thousands of ears at once. People flinched in their kitchens, children paused mid-play, shopkeepers stepped into their doorways, brows furrowed. The Reverend rang the bell again, and again, and again, 12 times, a dozen heartbeats tolling through fog. When he stopped, the silence that followed felt alive, heavy, expectant, as though London itself were holding its breath. In the days that followed, more parishioners came to him. Some sought comfort, some sought answers, some simply sat in the pews and whispered prayers that sounded more like confessions. Whitcomb reassured them with scripture, though his own faith trembled at the edges. He spoke of endurance, charity, vigilance, but each night, when he lay in bed, he heard the bells echo in his dreams, those 12 notes, each one a reminder of the uncertainty settling over the city like thick fog. And across London, in streets far from his parish, others heard the ringing too, not the sound itself, but the meaning behind it. Something was coming, something old, something polite in its arrival, something that made even the clergyman fear he had rung too many bells, or not nearly enough. By the time Reverend Whitcomb's midnight bells had echoed through Clerkenwell for a full fortnight, the city's whispers had swelled into something larger, something with teeth. Londoners had always been skilled at speculation, able to spin stories from shadows, to craft rumours from the faintest shift in a neighbour's expression. But this time, the whispers carried an urgency that spread faster than the disease itself. At first, speculation drifted quietly through drawing rooms and taverns, threading itself between conversations about the weather, wages, and the rising price of bread. But soon it began to sharpen. Words took on edges, sentences became daggers. In the offices of the London Herald, the editor, Mr. Ambrose Harker, stood before his printing press with a frown carved deep into his brow. His hands trembled faintly, whether from the cold or from something else he would not say. Stacks of paper waited to be fed into the machine, each sheet blank but laden with possibility. Behind him, a junior reporter hovered nervously. "The rumours are growing, sir," the reporter ventured. "People say it's spreading." "They always say that," Harker replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "But this feels different." Harker glanced at the notes scattered across his desk. Reports of withdrawn servants, shuttered boarding houses, families departing London without notice, physicians refusing to comment. And then the detail that chilled him, most multiple letters from readers mentioning pale patches, smooth as polished bone. He tapped the papers with a trembling finger. "We cannot print the word," he murmured. "It would empty the streets. So we continue with euphemisms?" For now. That day's issue carried an article titled "A Curious Skin Affliction in the East End," written with delicate concern but deliberate vagueness. Infection was never mentioned. Contagion was dismissed as unlikely. The symptoms were referred to as surface anomalies. The piece landed on breakfast tables across the city, offering reassurance while stoking unease like a surgeon, speaking gently as he sharpened a scalpel. Across London, the article produced the opposite of its intended effect. Shopkeepers discussed it between customers. Carriage drivers repeated it at coffee stands. Dock workers argued about it on break, their voices low, their expressions drawn. And in the wealthier districts, ladies tucked the newspaper beneath their plates, unwilling to let the children read it, yet unable to stop reading it themselves. Speculation blossomed like mold in damp corners. "It's a new plague," some said. "No, it's foreign, brought from the colonies," others insisted. "A punishment," murmured the devout. "A sign of moral decay," concluded the self-righteous. Rumours took on forms more grotesque with each telling. A maid in Kensington swore she had seen a man collapse on the pavement, his face pale and crumbling. A bookseller claimed he heard of a child whose hands turned to marble. A cabman insisted that a policeman fainted after touching a sick beggar, though no such incident appeared in any official report. The city, always hungry for drama, now fed on fear. But it wasn't only the poor and the superstitious who speculated. In the parlour of Lady Constance Weatherby, a woman known for her scientific gatherings and sharp intellect, several academics had assembled to discuss the matter over steaming cups of chamomile. A medieval disease resurfacing in the modern age? Scoffed a young physician. Impossible. And yet, replied another, older man, leaning forward, we cannot dismiss the consistency of the symptoms. Lady Weatherby's gaze drifted to the fire. If it is what we suspect, she whispered, London will not take it quietly. The room fell silent. Outside her window, the fog curled upward like smoke from a smouldering match. In the taverns, in the parlours, in the cramped kitchens and spacious dining halls, fear deepened its roots, weaving itself into conversations like a hidden thread. People watched their neighbours more closely. They watched their own hands. Gloves became fashionable even indoors. Handshakes grew brisk. Hugs became rare. Some avoided certain streets, others avoided certain people. Speculation had become a fever, a collective heat that flushed the cheeks, quickened the breath, and tightened the city's pulse. No single rumour was enough to cause panic, but together they formed a quiet storm. A storm that London, already trembling beneath its polished surface, was utterly unprepared to weather. And somewhere in a quiet ward that smelled of carbolic, the laundress of Stepney lay awake, unaware that her pale hands had become the centre of a city's rising dread. Constable Henry Latchford had always trusted the streets of Bishopsgate more than he trusted people. Streets, after all, were honest. They told you exactly what had happened if you knew how to read them. The scuffed cobblestones, the dropped coin, the broken window pane, the faint trace of blood near a gutter. People, by contrast, concealed everything. They hid their troubles behind softened voices and hurried steps. They masked fear with laughter. They veiled sickness with scarves and long sleeves. But lately, even the streets were lying. It was early evening when Latchford first sensed something amiss. The fog that night was unusually thick, settling low as if it wished to crawl along the ground. Gas lamps glowed through it like half-drowned stars. The constable walked his usual route, boots steady, lantern swinging at his side. The air tasted faintly metallic, too clean for Bishopsgate, a neighbourhood known for its honest filth. Turning the corner near Spitalfields, he noticed a figure huddled beneath a doorway. At first, he assumed the man was merely drunk or cold, but as he drew near, he realized the man was neither. He was trembling. "Evening," Latchford said, keeping his voice firm but gentle. "Are you unwell, sir?" The man lifted his head. His eyes were wide, wild with something deeper than pain. He clutched his hands to his chest, and when he lowered them a fraction, Latchford saw it. A pale patch, smooth, chalk-like, spreading across the back of the man's hand. Latchford felt his breath catch. Not from fear, he was not a man inclined to panic, but from recognition. He had heard the whispers. He had read the articles. He had listened to the midnight bells that seemed to toll just for him. "Sir," he said, "you should see a physician." The man shook his head violently, backing further into the shadow of the doorway. "No doctors," he rasped. "They'll lock me away." Latchford took a cautious step forward. "You're shivering. Let me help." "Don't touch me," the man cried, pressing himself against the brick, leaving a faint smear of something pale behind. Latchford froze, not because of the man's words, but because he had seen that smear before. Months earlier, as a younger constable, he had read a medical report describing an illness found in distant colonies, an illness that left marks like chalk on the walls where the afflicted rested their hands. But that had been half a world away, impossible to imagine in modern London. And yet, here it was, in Bishopsgate, under his lantern light. The constable steadied himself. Duty was duty, and fear had no place in it. "Listen to me," he said slowly. "There's an infirmary nearby. They'll know what to do." The man laughed bitterly, a sound sharp enough to cut through the fog. "They know, all right. They know too well." Latchford approached another step, but the man bolted suddenly, darting into the alley like a frightened animal. Latchford followed, his lantern swinging wildly, light bouncing across brick walls stained with soot. The man was fast, desperate. He stumbled only once, enough for Latchford to catch sight of the spreading patches on his neck. When the alley abruptly ended at a tall wooden fence, the man collapsed to his knees, defeated. Latchford stopped several feet behind him, chest heaving. "I can't go with you," the man whispered. "I've seen what happens to people like me." Latchford tightened his grip on the lantern. "And what is that?" They disappear. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant rumble of a carriage and the soft hiss of a gas lamp nearing extinction. Latchford set the lantern down, letting its glow soften the shadows. "If you don't come with me," he said quietly, "I'll have to call others. They won't be as gentle." The man nodded weakly, shame and terror mingling in his expression. He rose slowly, clutching his arms close to his chest, careful not to brush the constable. They walked back toward the street, the fog parting around them like a curtain reluctant to reveal the scene. And as Latchford led the man toward the infirmary, he felt it, that strange heaviness in the air, that eerie quiet that falls before a storm. London was watching them, watching the pale patches, watching the fear. The constable lifted his lantern. Its flame trembled. And, for the first time in years, Henry Latchford wished he were walking anywhere else but Bishopsgate. It began with a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as though the city itself had paused mid-inhale. London was not a quiet place, not even in the dead hours when taverns shuttered and factory whistles slept. There were always footsteps somewhere, carts rumbling over cobblestones, distant shouts from night workers, the low hum of a metropolis that refused to sleep. But on this particular night, as fog rolled in thick as wool, the usual symphony faded into a hush that made even the street lamps seem hesitant to flicker. In the infirmary ward that smelled of carbolic, the laundress lay awake, staring at the ceiling where shadows curled and twisted like uneasy dreams. She could feel the fear in the room, the shallow breaths of her fellow patients, the nervous movements of nurses passing between the beds. The candles on the far table burned lower than usual, their flames bending as if bowing to something unseen. Outside the window, the fog pressed hard against the glass, as though the city were trying to smother itself. Far across London, in Bishopsgate, Constable Latchford had just escorted the trembling man with the chalk-white hands into the hospital. As he stepped back into the street, closing the infirmary door behind him, he noticed the air felt heavier than before, thick, stagnant, heavy with the unspoken. Even the usually unruly crowd near the market had dispersed early, leaving only stray crates and wilted produce behind. He walked his beat with a growing sense that something had shifted beneath the surface of the city, like water beneath ice. At St. Bartholomew's, Reverend Whitcomb knelt trembling beside his narrow bed, unable to sleep. He heard the bells ringing in his memory, the ones he had pulled with such urgency, and he wondered if they had awakened something he could not quell. The church itself seemed to exhale cold draughts into the vicarage. Somewhere in the nave, a door creaked. He did not investigate. And in the printing room of the London Herald, Ambrose Harker stood alone beside the idle press. He stared at the morning edition locked in its frame, waiting to be printed, its headlines soft, evasive, almost cowardly. A puzzling skin complaint continues to concern locals. He knew it wasn't enough. He knew it concealed more than it revealed. He also knew that writing the truth might ignite a blaze of panic no headline could contain. His fingers hovered over the type. He failed to change a single letter. London that night felt poised between two breaths, the last belonging to ignorance, the next belonging to fear. Just after midnight, the wind shifted. Not sharply, not violently, but with a slow and subtle shiver, like fabric drawn across a table. The fog stirred, lamps fluttered. Somewhere far away, a dog howled once, then went silent. The laundress felt it first. A sudden coldness passed over her skin, numbing even the parts of her that still held warmth. She sat up, heart pounding, as the air in the ward thickened with unease. Nurses exchanged glances. A patient at the far end coughed a deep, hollow sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet. Then, footsteps. Rushed. Heavy. Urgent. Dr. Fenwick appeared in the doorway, his face pale beneath the lamplight. He spoke to the nurse in hushed tones, glancing repeatedly toward the ward. The laundress couldn't hear the words, but she could see the fear. It was unmistakable, soft around the edges, like a fog bank of dread. Moments later, a stretcher was wheeled in. On it lay a young man, a gentleman, judging by the cut of his coat, his glove removed, his hand exposed to the lamplight. The laundress saw the patch immediately. White as bone, smooth as marble. But this time, the patch was not alone. It spread across his forearm like frost blooming on a winter window. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttered as though trapped between waking and oblivion. A murmur rippled through the ward. Reverend Whitcomb, miles away, jolted upright in bed, as though sensing the same moment. Constable Latchford paused mid-step beneath a street lamp, hand instinctively on his whistle, though he didn't know why. Ambrose Harker dropped a typeset piece of lead onto the floor, the small clink echoing like a warning. In the ward, the candle nearest the stretcher guttered once, twice, then went out. A nurse relit it with trembling hands. Another flame wavered. London held its breath. Something old, something the city had buried beneath centuries of progress, soot, and polite modernity, had stirred. And on that fog-laden night, in hospitals and parishes and quiet lamplit streets, the truth settled heavily upon every living soul. The disease had not come to London. It had awakened, and for the first time, London understood the terrible weight of silence that precedes a storm. The house on Grosvenor Square was known for its elegance, crisp white columns, polished brass knockers, windows that gleamed even on fog-choked mornings. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lavender and old money. It was the sort of home where illness had no place, where troubles were expected to enter through the servant's door and leave just as quietly. Clara, the youngest housemaid, had been working there barely 6 months. She scrubbed floors, polished silver, and lit evening lamps with the quiet efficiency expected of her. She was small, soft-spoken, with a habit of keeping her gaze fixed on the carpet whenever the mistress entered the room. But lately, Clara had begun wearing gloves at all hours. At first, no one noticed. Maids wore gloves when handling fragile china or hot kettles. But Clara never removed hers, not at meals, not during washing, not even when scrubbing the marble steps where gloves were more hindrance than help. When the butler finally asked why she kept them on, she only smiled faintly and murmured, "For protection, sir." It was the sort of answer that satisfied no one. At night, Clara shared a small attic room with 2 other maids. The space was narrow and draughty, filled with the smell of damp fabric and coal dust that never seemed to wash out of their uniforms. She slept closest to the window, where moonlight cast long, cold beams across her blanket. That was when she removed the gloves. Under the pale glow, her hands looked wrong. A white patch spread across her left palm, blooming outward like frost on iron. It was smooth, too smooth, and unnervingly cool. She'd first noticed it 2 weeks earlier, brushing against a chipped tile in the scullery. She had pulled back instinctively, expecting a sting, but she hadn't felt the tile at all. No sensation, just absence. Each night the patch grew, inch by inch, until it became impossible to ignore. She could not confess it. She could not reveal it. Housemaids were replaced easily. Ill ones were dismissed even faster. And Clara, whose wages fed her mother and two younger sisters on the outskirts of the city, could not risk dismissal. So she hid her hands the way a Victorian woman hid her fears, neatly, quietly, beneath a veil of fabric. But others noticed. There was the older maid, Miss Hardy, who observed Clara dropping a teacup without flinching at the scalding water. There was the cook, who saw her gripping a hot pan with surprising calm. There was the mistress, who found a bloodless smear on the banister, smooth, pale, dust-like. Rumours spread through the household staff with the same velocity as through the streets of Stepney and Bishopsgate. Clara heard them as she polished silverware, her pulse sharp in her throat. She doesn't feel pain. She's becoming smooth. Something's wrong with that girl's skin. One evening, while Clara was lighting the parlour lamps, the mistress summoned her. The room glowed warmly, filled with floral wallpaper and velvet drapes that muffled the outside world. The mistress, upright and elegant in her ivory gown, studied the girl's gloved hands with a narrowed gaze. "Clara," she said softly, "remove your gloves." Clara froze. "Madam, I—" "Remove them." Slowly, trembling, Clara peeled off the gloves. The mistress gasped, not loudly, but with a sudden intake of breath sharp as shattered glass. The patch had spread from palm to fingers, covering them in a ghostly sheen. "How long?" the mistress whispered. Clara's shoulders sagged. "A few weeks, madam." A silence followed, long, suffocating, heavy with implications neither dared name. In the corner of the room, the grandfather clock ticked with unnatural loudness. Finally, the mistress spoke, her voice quieter than candle smoke. "You must leave the house. Tonight." Clara's heart dropped. "Madam, please, I have nowhere." "You must go," the mistress repeated. "For your sake, and for ours." She opened her purse, withdrew a small stack of shillings, and pressed it into Clara's trembling hands. It was more money than Clara had ever held at once, yet she felt none of it. The coins were cold, foreign weights. She left through the back entrance, shawl pulled tight, fog swirling around her like a cloak. The street lamps flickered, their golden halos warping in the mist. Behind her, the grand house of Grosvenor Square closed its doors as though shutting out a ghost. As she walked into the deepening night, Clara felt the numbness creeping up her wrist. She pressed her hand against her throat, not for warmth, but for proof that she was still alive. In a city that refused to speak the word leprosy, Clara knew she was now part of its whispered vocabulary. And somewhere far away, in a ward smelling of carbolic, a laundress slept with the same pale patches blooming across her skin. London's quiet epidemic had claimed another life. And no one, not even Clara herself, yet understood how many more would follow. The blue bottle stood on a high shelf in Dr. Fenwick's private room, catching the lamplight in a way that made it seem almost luminous. Its contents shimmered faintly, a liquid the color of diluted cobalt, clear yet strangely heavy, as if it carried secrets suspended within. Every surgeon had tools they depended on, but this bottle was different. It was a quiet companion of the night, placed just out of reach, always visible, never used without hesitation. It contained a tonic Fenwick had begun mixing himself, a concoction of antiseptics, mineral extracts, and a rare imported compound used experimentally on skin conditions in distant colonies. The recipe was imprecise, the results uncertain. But London was running out of precision, and certainty had already fled. Dr. Fenwick stared at the bottle long after the ward grew silent, after the nurses finished their rounds, after the last candle was trimmed, after the laundress's laboured breathing settled into a fragile rhythm. He felt the weight of the city pressing in on him, the pressure of an illness that refused to behave like anything taught in medical schools. He lit a small oil lamp and unlocked the cabinet. The blue bottle gleamed. Fenwick hesitated. He had sworn to do no harm, but harm now felt like an old acquaintance, familiar and uninvited. The pale patches spreading through London reminded him of drawings from colonial reports, diseases whispered about but never spoken of openly, because empire preferred its shadows quiet. He lifted the bottle. Its cool surface trembled faintly against his fingers. A knock on the door startled him. Nurse Ethel Hartley stepped inside, her face tight with worry. She closed the door softly behind her, as though afraid noise itself might attract the disease. "You're still awake," she said. "I must be," Fenwick murmured. "The city isn't sleeping. Why should I?" She approached the desk and lowered her voice. 3 new patients arrived from Spitalfields tonight, all with the same markings. He felt the bottle grow heavier in his hand. "Are they stable?" "No, and 2 show advanced neural involvement." She swallowed. "The numbness has reached their faces." A moment of silence passed between them, thick and suffocating. "They're putting them in the carbolic ward?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The others insisted. Her voice softened with sorrow. "Fear is spreading faster than the illness, Doctor." Fenwick set the blue bottle gently on the desk. The lamplight made its contents glow like embedded frost. He exhaled. "I need to try this mixture." Hartley's eyes widened. "On whom?" Fenwick looked toward the hallway, where the faint smell of carbolic drifted like a ghostly warning. Someone in the early stages. Someone whose symptoms have not yet crossed the threshold. "You mean the laundress?" He didn't respond. Nurse Hartley's expression shifted from alarm to reluctant understanding. "You think it might help?" "I think," Fenwick said slowly, "that if we do nothing, we will be studying funerals instead of patients." He picked up a glass dropper and opened the bottle. The scent that wafted out was sharp, clean, almost sweet, with an undercurrent of something metallic, something ancient. Hartley stepped back slightly. "It smells like—" "Yes," he said. "I know." Fenwick carried the bottle down the dim hallway, the floorboards creaking softly under his steps. The ward was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of blankets and the faint moan of a patient dreaming badly. As he approached the laundress's bed, he noticed her pale hands folded neatly on her chest, the white patches gleaming like reflected moonlight. She stirred. "Doctor, I need to examine you again," he said gently. "This may sting." She nodded, trusting him with the kind of trust that weighed heavily on a man's conscience. Fenwick applied a few drops of the tonic to her wrist. The liquid spread slowly, clinging to her skin before sinking in. The laundress winced, though not from pain. She felt the pressure but no sensation beneath. He watched closely. The blue liquid darkened where it touched the pale patch, then faded to transparency. The skin did not improve, but something subtle shifted. The borders of the patch seemed to tighten, contracting as though reacting to the intrusion. It wasn't a cure, but it was a response. Fenwick's pulse quickened. "Remarkable." Behind him, Nurse Hartley whispered, "Is that good?" "I don't know," he admitted, voice trembling with equal parts hope and dread. "But it is something." The laundress closed her eyes, exhausted. The ward returned to stillness. Fenwick held the blue bottle tightly, his reflection warped in its curved glass. Whatever this illness was, it was waking, responding, learning. And in the city, beyond the infirmary walls, in attics, parishes, marketplaces, and fine houses, more pale patches were blooming by the hour. The bottle would not be enough. But tonight, it was all he had. And London, silent and trembling in the thick fog, waited for a cure that did not yet exist. The boarding house on Upper Street had once been a cheerful establishment, 3 floors of modest comfort, lace curtains in the windows, and a landlady who believed a pot of tea could mend any sorrow. A brass plaque by the door read Mrs. Henley's Lodgings, its shine maintained daily with an enthusiasm bordering on devotion. Travellers, clerks, and widows passing through the city often praised its warmth. But by early spring, the warmth had begun to cool. It began with a tenant on the second floor, a quiet man named Mr. Warner, who worked as a clerk at the telegraph office. He paid his rent on time, took his meals in silence, and carried himself with the weary politeness of someone accustomed to working in cramped spaces. Mrs. Henley considered him the ideal lodger. Until the morning she noticed he wore gloves at breakfast. Not the respectable leather gloves of a gentleman outdoors, but thin cotton gloves stained faintly at the fingertips. When she asked whether he was feeling cold, he gave a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a precaution," he said, tucking his hands beneath the table. But by the next week, the other tenants had begun whispering. "He doesn't eat much anymore," murmured Mrs. Hollings, the widow in room 5. "He's gone pale," added young Mr. Whitlow, who occupied the garret room where the roof leaked when it rained. "I heard him drop a lamp," whispered another. "Glass shattered everywhere, yet he didn't cry out." Mrs. Henley tried to dismiss their concerns. London was a city of eccentrics, and she prided herself on discretion. But the moment that shattered her composure came late one evening when she went upstairs to collect laundry from the drying rack. The door to Mr. Warner's room was ajar. She knocked softly. "Mr. Warner, are you well?" No answer. She pushed the door open a little farther, and her breath caught in her throat. Mr. Warner sat at the edge of his bed, back hunched, face buried in his gloved hands. The lamplight cast a faint golden halo around him, yet he seemed enveloped in shadow. When he heard her step, he jerked upright, instinctively pulling his hands behind him. Something had fallen to the floor beside his chair. A glove, and beneath it, a patch of skin pale as bleached parchment, utterly without texture. Smooth, bloodless, wrong. Mrs. Henley felt the air leave her lungs. "Mr. Warner." He stared at her with hollow resignation. "I was hoping," he whispered, "to leave before anyone noticed." "You must see a doctor." He shook his head. "I have. He sent me away with a warning. I cannot repeat." The room felt suddenly colder, as though winter had seeped through the cracks in the walls. Mrs. Henley backed toward the doorway, heart pounding hard enough to ache. The next morning, she asked Mr. Warner to leave. There was no anger in her voice, only fear wrapped in courtesy. He packed his belongings quietly. As he descended the staircase, gloves pulled tightly over his hands. The other tenants watched from the landings with expressions somewhere between pity and dread. When the front door closed behind him, silence settled over the boarding house like dust. But silence did not keep fear out. 2 days later, the widow Mrs. Hollings came down to breakfast with her shawl tugged high around her neck. She kept her right hand tucked beneath it, refusing toast, refusing conversation. When Mrs. Henley reached for her arm in concern, the widow recoiled so sharply, her chair scraped across the floor. "I'm quite all right," she insisted. She was not. That evening, Miss Darwell from room 3 found a smear, white, powdery, unsettling on the banister. She refused to touch it. None of the others did either. By week's end, 3 tenants had left without notice. Mr. Whitlow fled in the night, leaving his rent unpaid and his window open to the fog. Mrs. Henley, who had spent decades maintaining a reputation for cleanliness and composure, now scrubbed the stairs with such ferocity that her knuckles split. The smell of carbolic clung to every floorboard, every curtain, even her own hair. But carbolic could not disguise the truth. The boarding house had become a vessel for fear. A single case, one pale hand hidden in cotton gloves, had unravelled the delicate peace of Islington. And as Mr. Warner disappeared into the labyrinth of London's streets, he became part of a growing pattern, a spreading constellation of quiet tragedies. Mrs. Henley knew, deep down, that more would follow, because in a city built on close quarters and polite silence, secrets seldom stayed contained, and illness, once inside a home, learned its own way of opening doors. Mr. Edwin Marbury had kept his apothecary on Lamb's Conduit Street for nearly 20 years. It was a narrow shop, its shelves lined with glass jars labeled in neat handwriting: tincture of lavender, spirits of ammonia, laudanum, salicylic powder. In the evenings, the scent of eucalyptus and camphor drifted through the door, mingling with the damp London air. It was the sort of place where ordinary ailments found ordinary remedies. But lately, nothing felt ordinary. His ledger, usually a tidy record of stomach powders and sleeping draughts, had begun to reflect an unsettling pattern. He first noticed it early in the season, an unusual rise in the purchase of antiseptics, carbolic acid, phenol, astringent tonics. At first, he attributed it to winter colds or the usual anxieties of crowded tenement life. But then, the requests grew stranger. A woman asked for ointments to soothe skin that feels cold even when warm. A dock worker purchased 2 bottles of mineral spirits, insisting he needed them to keep something from spreading. A gentleman from Clerkenwell ordered gloves by the dozen, his hands shaking as he counted out the coins. And then came the requests for the blue remedy. Patients whispered about it in low tones, something they heard from a friend of a friend. A tonic used in quiet hospital rooms, a mixture said to slow the pale patches. Some asked if Mr. Marbury carried it. Others asked if he could make it. He did neither. But the whispers accumulated like dust on his shelves. One evening, as he prepared to close the shop, a young girl entered, no more than 12. Her dress was frayed at the hem, and her boots were wet with street water. She approached the counter with timid steps. "Please, sir," she said, placing a coin on the counter. "I need something for my brother. His skin," she faltered. "It looks strange." Mr. Marbury's heart tightened. "Strange how, child?" "White," she whispered, "like chalk, and he says he can't feel it when I touch it. Not at all." He steadied himself. "Where is your brother now?" "At home. He's scared. Mother told me to fetch something, anything." Mr. Marbury looked at the coin, small, insufficient, and felt the weight of helplessness settle upon him. He reached for a jar of mild antiseptic salve, wrapped it carefully, and placed it in her hands. "This may help," he said gently, "but you must take him to the infirmary." The girl shook her head violently. "No, they take people away there." Her eyes glistened. "He doesn't want to disappear." Before he could say more, she turned and fled into the fog. Marbury stood behind the counter, shaken. He opened his ledger, flipping through recent entries. Each line told a story: fear disguised as practicality, desperation masked as routine. At the bottom of the page was an order placed that morning by a physician, Dr. Fenwick, of Mile End Infirmary. The request was precise. Carbolic solutions, 4 bottles. Mineral extract base, 3 vials. Ether, medical grade, 1 flask. Copper salts, purified, 1 ounce. Marbury stared at the list. He recognized the components. It was the same mixture whispered about by customers. The blue remedy. His pulse quickened. He stepped into the back room, unlocked a tall cabinet, and removed a small wooden box. Inside lay the remaining stock of copper salts, a substance rarely requested, as it stained everything it touched and left a bitter, metallic scent. Yet here it was, demanded in quantity by a man who surely knew more than he admitted. Outside, a carriage rattled past, its wheels splashing through puddles. Marbury heard the creaking of its axles as the sound faded into the night. He returned to the counter and lit a second lamp. Shadows danced along the shelves like restless figures. The apothecary, usually cheerful in its clutter, now felt watchful, its jars and bottles like silent witnesses. For the first time in years, Marbury added a private note in the margins of his ledger. Multiple purchases of antiseptics, increased fear among customers, reports of numb, pale patches, possible contagion, too many coincidences. He paused before adding one last line. "Something is happening in London." As he closed the shop for the night, locking the door with trembling fingers, He glanced toward the fog-shrouded street. The lamps flickered, the shadows lengthened, and he felt deep in his bones that the pale patches would soon outnumber his remedies. London, he realized, was shifting beneath its own skin, and the ledger was only the beginning. The dinner parties at the Harrington residence were never modest affairs. Every Thursday evening, the drawing room filled with the faint scent of rosewater, the muted clinking of silver, and the low, cultured hum of conversation. Polished mirrors reflected soft lamplight, creating the illusion of warmth even when the London fog pressed hard against the windows. Guests arrived in their finest attire, silk gowns, crisp waistcoats, polished boots, and offered polite smiles as though politeness itself could anchor the world against unseen chaos. But this evening, something felt different. Something subtle but unmistakable. It entered the room with Mr. Archibald Thorne, an impeccably groomed gentleman known for his punctuality and refined charm. He wore a navy tailcoat, his hair brushed back with careful precision, and at his side hung a pocket watch of gleaming silver. And he wore gloves, black leather gloves, indoors. At a dinner party, Lady Harrington, attentive as ever, noticed immediately. She approached with a graceful tilt of her head, her expression warm but curious. "Mr. Thorne," she greeted, "shall I take your gloves for the evening?" He stiffened almost imperceptibly. "No," he said with a disarming smile. "I prefer to keep them on tonight. A chill in my bones." "A chill?" Lady Harrington echoed. The parlour was quite warm, the fireplace crackling with vibrant life. But she did not press him. Politeness was the one religion London society practiced faithfully. Yet the guests noticed. They whispered between sips of sherry. "Gloves indoors? Perhaps he's grown eccentric. No, those are fitted too tightly for fashion. He ate with them on. Good heavens, did you see him cut the lamb?" Mr. Thorne maintained composure, though beneath the polite facade his movements betrayed a faint tremor. When he reached for his wineglass, his wrist stiffened unnaturally, as if he feared the leather might shift. When dessert was served, lemon tarts and sugared plums, Lady Harrington's cousin, Miss Adeline Hartwell, spoke lightly across the table. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying the precision of a well-aimed arrow, "the gloves must be terribly warm. Surely they cannot be comfortable?" He froze, the fork suspended midway between plate and mouth. A moment too long passed. Then he lowered the utensil, the faintest sheen of sweat forming at his temple. "I assure you, Miss Hartwell," he replied softly, "comfort has very little to do with it." A hush settled over the table. Lady Harrington quickly shifted the discussion to a less fraught topic, but the air had already changed. The dinner continued, laughter soft but strained, forks moving with mechanical rhythm. Later, when the clock struck 9, Mr. Thorne excused himself early, apologizing with a thin smile. As he reached for his hat, the butler, Mr. Avery, accidentally brushed against his arm. A faint sound escaped Mr. Thorne. Not pain, not surprise. Something closer to dread. Mr. Avery drew his hand back sharply. The glove had left behind a smear on the polished hat stand, a pale mark like dust from crushed chalk. Mr. Thorne snatched his hat, nodded stiffly, and stepped out into the fog. After the door clicked shut, Lady Harrington looked closely at the smear. The colour drained from her face. She wiped it away with a linen cloth that she immediately dropped into the fire. "What is it?" Miss Hartwell asked. Lady Harrington did not answer. She simply closed the parlour doors with unnecessary force and ordered the windows open despite the chill outside. That night, she wrote a letter addressed not to a friend nor a relative, but to a certain Dr. Fenwick at the Mile End Infirmary. The letter was short, written in a trembling hand. "A gentleman of respectable standing presents with a condition I dare not name. His hands remain covered. He avoids touch. A pale residue remains where he rests them. I fear he is unwell, and I fear for those around him." I beg you, advise what must be done." She sealed the letter with wax, then sat in the quiet room, feeling her own breath grow shallow. Meanwhile, Mr. Thorne hurried through the mist, pulling off one glove with shaking fingers. His hand beneath glimmered in the lamplight, white, smooth, absent of sensation. A faint patch crossed his knuckles like winter frost. He flexed his fingers. No feeling. Not even fear registered fully. Only numbness. Only silence. Only the cold certainty that he was now part of the very rumour London refused to speak aloud. And as he vanished into the thick fog, the city, polished, glittering, oblivious, continued its evening rituals, unaware that its fine gloves, its pressed linens, and its sparkling silverware could not protect it from what walked quietly among them. London's disease had entered drawing rooms, and it had done so wearing gloves. The hansom cab rattled unevenly along Whitechapel Road, its wheels cutting shallow grooves through the wet sheen that coated the cobblestones. Fog hung low, so low that it seemed to brush the horse's flanks, coiling around its legs like something alive and curious. The driver, perched above in his thick coat and muffler, cursed softly under his breath as the lanterns flickered in and out of visibility. Even seasoned cabmen disliked fog this dense. It blurred distance, muted sound, and made London feel like a dream one might not wake from. Tonight, the fog felt heavier still. Inside the cab sat Mrs. Eliza Turner, a governess travelling home after a long day in Kensington. She clutched her carpet bag tightly against her lap, feeling the chill seep through the thin leather gloves she wore. She had taken this route dozens of times, yet tonight the familiar journey felt foreign, strained as though the city itself were reluctant to be crossed. The driver leaned down as they paused near Aldgate. "Roads are near swallowed, miss," he said, voice muffled. "Fog won't lift till dawn, if then." "Please continue," Mrs. Turner said, though her voice trembled. She did not wish to remain exposed on the street. The cab jerked forward. On either side of the road, Whitechapel's narrow alleys hunched inward, lined with cheap lodgings and overburdened dwellings, where entire families pressed into rooms so small the walls grew slick with shared breath. Lamps glowed faintly behind grimy windows. Shapes moved within shadows indistinguishable from the fog. As they turned onto a quieter stretch, Mrs. Turner noticed a figure stumbling near the curb. The driver slowed instinctively, horse snorting in protest. The figure, likely a man by the breadth of his shoulders, leaned heavily against a lamppost, clutching it with one hand while the other pressed against his chest. His hat was gone. His hair hung damp and tangled. "Another drunk," the driver muttered. "Whitechapel's full of them." But Mrs. Turner felt no such certainty. The man's posture was not the loose, lurching sway of drunkenness. It was rigid, trembling. She leaned to the window, peering closely as the cab rolled nearer. Then she saw his hand. Pale, unnaturally pale, even in the fog, even under the anemic lamplight. His fingers gleamed with a waxen smoothness that made her breath catch. The man lifted his head. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. There was no drunken fog in his gaze, only terror. He stumbled forward, reaching toward the cab with a desperate cry that died in his throat. Mrs. Turner recoiled as his hand pressed briefly against the side of the cab, leaving behind a faint, chalky smear. "Go!" she cried. "Go now!" The driver cracked the reins, and the cab lurched forward, wheels slipping as the horse surged into the fog. "Missus!" Turner pressed herself into the corner, trembling violently, eyes fixed on the smear outside the window until it vanished into the night. "What was it?" the driver called back, not daring to look. She swallowed hard. "Not drink," she whispered. "Not drink at all." The cab sped past shuttered shops, past the silent workhouses, past Whitechapel's cramped labyrinth of alleyways. But the fear travelled with her, clinging to her like the damp fog itself. A few streets later, they were forced to stop again. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of an alley, murmuring in anxious tones. Mrs. Turner leaned out despite herself, the cold air biting her cheeks. "Another one," someone whispered. "God help us." Two men dragged a limp figure toward the curb. Mrs. Turner saw its hand dangling loosely, fingers pale, smooth, unflinching even as they scraped against the stones. The same color, the same texture, the same silence. The driver swore under his breath and urged the horse onward before anyone could ask for help. The cab sped into the fog like a creature fleeing a predator. Finally, when they reached the quieter outskirts near Mrs. Turner's lodgings, she stepped out on trembling legs. Her gloves, once merely cold, now felt suffocating. She removed them shakily and froze. On the fingertips, faint but unmistakable, were pale smudges, from where the infected man had touched the cab, or from where she had touched the cab to steady herself. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Miss?" the driver asked softly. "Are you quite well?" She forced a nod, though her breath was thin and tight. "Good night," she whispered, stepping back into the fog. As she walked toward her modest rooms, the mist wrapped around her like an unwelcome companion. Behind her, the cab disappeared into the night, leaving only the faint echo of hooves and the ghost of a smear on its side. Whitechapel did not sleep that night, nor did Mrs. Turner, and London, already trembling beneath the weight of whispered illness, inhaled the fog, deeply unaware that its very breath was thick with dread. The old infirmary on Mile End Road had always carried an air of tired dignity, a building that had seen too much sorrow to pretend at gentility, yet still maintained its posture with the pride of an aging soldier. Its stone facade was weathered, its corridors narrow, and its windows tall and draughty. But the nurses kept it impeccably clean, and the matron, Mrs. Agatha Brindle, ran it with the unwavering precision of a ship's captain. Nothing escaped her notice. Nothing ever had, until the pale patches began to appear. At first, there were only whispers, quiet mentions of numb fingers, cool skin, and patients who winced not from pain but from the absence of it. The surgeons attributed these cases to frostbite, nerve damage, or simple fatigue. But Matron Brindle had seen enough winters, enough epidemics, enough suffering to recognize when something old and unwelcome was walking the halls again. She had been a young nurse during the final whispers of the old colonial fevers, a time when sailors brought back more than goods from abroad. She remembered the lesions, the numbness, the quiet terror of an illness no one named aloud. She had never expected to see signs of it again. Not here, not in London. Yet she was seeing them now, and she knew what must be done. The matron opened a ward that did not exist on the infirmary's official plan. It was a narrow room at the end of the east wing, a former storage space with high arched windows that rattled in the wind. The walls were lined with old iron bedsteads that had been retired years ago. Dust had collected on the sills. The floor creaked with age. But the matron scrubbed it herself, scrubbing until her knuckles bled, then ordered two nurses she trusted to prepare linens, blankets, and basins of carbolic. "No one is to speak of this room," she instructed, her voice quiet but edged. "Not to the doctors, not to the attendants, not to one another outside its walls." The nurses exchanged uneasy glances but complied. One did not question Matron Brindle. Her authority was a force in itself, quiet, unyielding, and absolute. The first patient placed in the secret ward was an elderly seamstress whose fingertips had turned white and smooth, the texture of polished stone. She had come in complaining of dizziness, but it was her hands that betrayed her. The matron settled her gently into the cleaned bed, drew the curtain, and instructed the nurses to use separate towels, separate basins, separate everything. "We care for her," she said firmly, "but we do not linger." The next day brought two more. By the end of the week, the ward held 6. None knew why they had been placed there. None questioned the matron's solemn expression. but they sensed something, an air of quiet isolation that chilled the bones more than the drafty windows ever could. At night, while London slept fitfully under its blanket of fog, Matron Brindle walked the length of the secret ward like a sentinel. Her footsteps were soft, her lantern dimmed. She checked each patient with a tenderness that belied her stern reputation, adjusting blankets, moistening lips, brushing strands of hair from fevered brows. She noticed patterns. The numbness spread slowly in some, and quickly in others. The skin grew pale first, then smooth, then cold in a way that reminded her of the stone walls of the infirmary basement. Patients grew quiet, withdrawn. Some stopped speaking entirely, as though words required a feeling they no longer possessed. And the worst part? They did not feel the decline. They felt nothing at all. One evening, as Matron Brindle made her rounds, a young nurse approached her, trembling. "Matron," she whispered, "Dr. Fenwick is asking questions. He wants to know why so many linens are missing from the central ward." The matron paused. For a moment, she felt a tremor of fear, rare for a woman who had weathered decades of sorrow. But she stood tall and answered, "Tell him the truth. We have patients who require privacy. He will not argue with that." "But shouldn't the doctors know?" the nurse asked softly. "Shouldn't they see?" Matron Brindle looked down the long row of beds, each one holding a pale, sleeping figure touched by something ancient. "No," she said quietly, "not yet." Her voice wavered, but only slightly. Fear spreads faster than illness. The lantern in her hand flickered, casting long shadows across the ward. Outside, the fog pressed against the high windows, as though it wished to seep inside. The matron tightened her grip on the lantern. She would keep the secret ward quiet for as long as she could. But deep down beneath the starched uniform, the iron discipline, the years of experience, she knew the truth. No locked door, no whispered silence. No hidden ward could contain what was drifting through London now. Not when the city itself had begun to tremble beneath its own skin. The Royal College of Physicians stood on Pall Mall like a fortress of polished knowledge columns gleaming, even through the murky London haze, brass plaques reflecting the dim afternoon light, and steps so meticulously scrubbed that the stone always appeared faintly wet. Inside, the air smelled of ink, tobacco, and quiet arrogance. It was a place where medicine dressed itself in confidence, even when uncertainty gnawed at its heels. On this particular evening, however, confidence had deserted the building. In a high-ceilinged conference room lined with anatomical drawings and dusty volumes, a group of physicians gathered around a long mahogany table. Lamps burned low, their light wavering against the green glass shades. The windows, tall and narrow, rattled periodically as the fog pressed against them, from outside an unwelcome guest trying to enter. Dr. Raymond Colchester, a senior fellow whose reputation was as polished as his silver-topped cane, sat at the head of the table, adjusting his spectacles with deliberate calm. Before him lay a stack of notes written in hurried, uneven handwriting. He did not like uneven handwriting. It suggested haste, and haste suggested fear. "I trust you have all read the report," he began, tapping the top page with a gloved finger. Around the table, chairs creaked, doctors shifted, a few cleared their throats. The report in question described a case brought quietly to the college by a surgeon from the East End, a gentleman in the early stages of a cutaneous abnormality. The description was cautious to the point of evasiveness. Phrases like loss of sensation, progressive pallor, surface smoothness, and neural dulling peppered the page but never touched the heart of the matter. Yet every man in the room recognized what the symptoms implied. None dared say it. Finally, Dr. Sefton Whitcomb, Reverend Whitcomb's distant cousin and one of the younger physicians present, broke the silence. "It is leprosy," he said quietly. The word fell into the room like a dropped scalpel. Several men flinched. One inhaled sharply. A single lamp guttered as though recoiling. Dr. Colchester's gaze snapped toward the young man. "We do not use that term," he said sharply. "But it fits," Whitcomb pressed. "It fits too well." Colchester stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "That word belongs to medieval manuscripts and superstitious imaginations, not London. Not now." "Then what would you call it?" Whitcomb asked. Colchester hesitated. A thin line of tension pulled across his jaw. "A neural dermopathy," he said eventually. "A degeneration of sensation, possibly environmental." The room murmured in uneasy agreement, not because they believed it, but because they needed something to believe. Whitcomb frowned. "With respect, sir, we are past comforting euphemisms. Cases are appearing all over the city. Clerkenwell, Stepney, Islington, Whitechapel. And they match each other too precisely for coincidence." Another physician, Dr. Henley, a stout man given to skepticism, interrupted. "You speak as though disease moves with intention." "It moves with opportunity," Whitcomb replied. "And London provides opportunity in every crowded street." The murmurs grew louder. Someone mentioned the sailors' wards from decades past. Someone else mentioned the colonies. A third noted that contagion of this sort, if it was contagion, would spread quietly, unnoticed, masked by politeness and shame. Colchester raised a hand, commanding silence. "This matter," he said, "is not to leave this room. Public panic would be catastrophic. The city is already ripe with fear. We must proceed cautiously, scientifically, and discreetly." He gestured to the notes. The surgeon who submitted this case suggested containing future patients for study, a controlled ward, limited access. Whitcomb's expression darkened. "You propose isolation. I propose prudence. You propose secrecy," Whitcomb countered. Colchester's voice dropped to a cold whisper. "Would you prefer we ring bells on every corner? Send London into hysteria? Watch markets collapse and families flee? We must protect the city." Whitcomb met his gaze. "And who will protect the patients?" The room fell silent again. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows, as though trying to smother the entire conversation. A carriage rolled past on the street, its wheels muffled almost entirely by the thick, damp air. Finally, Dr. Henley cleared his throat. "We cannot name it," he said, "not without proof." "And we cannot ignore it," Whitcomb insisted. Dr. Colchester slowly sat back down, smoothing the papers before him with precise, measured movements. "We will continue to observe the pattern," he said. "Quietly, if more cases arise, we will revisit the matter. Until then, we proceed with discretion." The meeting adjourned shortly after, but the unease remained lingering in the hallways like a faint, metallic scent. As Whitcomb stepped out into the night, the fog enveloped him immediately, cool and damp. He paused at the top of the stairs, staring toward the gas lamps glowing like dim moons through the haze. Behind him, within the Royal College's proud walls, knowledge had chosen silence over truth. Ahead of him, London hid within its fog, trembling beneath the pale touch of an illness no one dared name aloud. Whitcomb pulled his coat tight and descended the steps, his breath merging with the mist. If the disease continued to spread, he knew one thing for certain. Silence would not save them. Fog always settled thickest in the alleyways where London's poorest children played. Narrow brick walls funneled the damp inward, turning each cramped passage into a corridor of mist and echo. Here, boots were too large, coats were too thin, and laughter when it surfaced was sharp-edged, hungry, as if joy cost too much to be soft. That evening, in a soot-stained alley off Hanbury Street, a cluster of children gathered around a small fire built from scraps of crate wood. The flames flickered weakly, their glow failing to reach the dripping walls. The children huddled close, street orphans, half-orphans, children of mothers who worked too late and fathers who drank too early. They were London's unnoticed heartbeat, thudding along in the city's dark arteries. Little Tommy Briggs, no more than 8, tended the fire with a stick. His fingers were red from cold, but he didn't mind. The fire made him feel important, as though he were keeping the entire alley alive. Beside him sat Elsie Mott, her knees drawn up to her chest, her hair tangled from the wind. She coughed into her sleeve, one of those hollow, dry coughs common to children who slept on straw or not at all. "Got you something," Tommy said, grinning as he tugged something from his pocket. Elsie peered curiously. "What is it?" "Apple core. Still some good on it." She accepted it gratefully, nibbling the last soft edges. A few other children, Michael, Hannah, and sweet-faced Mary Clover, sat nearby, playing a game with bottle caps and chalk lines drawn on the stones. It was Mary who noticed first. Tommy gripped the stick oddly, his thumb stiff, as though the joint were made of candle wax instead of bone. She watched him turn his wrist, watched the firelight catch on something pale. "Tommy," she whispered, "your hand's gone funny." The others turned. Tommy frowned. "What do you mean?" Elsie leaned closer. "Show us." Reluctantly, Tommy lifted his hand toward the fire. A pale patch stretched across the back of it, smooth, white, unnaturally still. The flames flickered gold against it, but the skin did not respond. It remained cool, unfeeling, almost reflective in its wrongness. Elsie recoiled. "Tommy, when that happened?" "Dunno," Tommy muttered. "Been like that since this morning. Don't hurt none." "Can you feel this?" Mary asked, poking his hand timidly. Tommy shrugged. "Not really. Feels like touching cloth." The children exchanged worried glances. They knew nothing of medical terminology, nothing of contagion, nothing of ancient diseases slithering back into the modern world. But they knew fear instinctively. They knew when something in their fragile universe had shifted. Michael pulled his hands into his sleeves. "Maybe you burned it." Tommy shook his head. "Burns hurt." Elsie's voice softened to a tremor. "My mum said there's a sickness going round. She said it makes your skin go pale." Michael scoffed. "Your mum says lots of things." Elsie didn't argue, but her eyes never left Tommy's hand. The fire sputtered as a gust of wind swept through the alley. The fog thickened, curling around their ankles. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolled one of Reverend Whitcomb's, faint but unmistakable. The children looked toward the sound, their small faces tense. "We should go home," Mary whispered. "Where to?" Michael muttered bitterly. The question drifted into the fog like a wounded bird. Before they could decide whether to disperse or huddle together, a shadow fell across the alley mouth. The children stiffened. Shapes appearing suddenly in Whitechapel fog usually meant troubled police, drunks, or worse. But this figure did not move like a drunk or a constable. It was a woman, a laundress, clothes damp, shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. Her gait was slow, hesitant, as though each step required negotiation with her own limbs. She paused at the entry to the alley, one hand on the wall for balance. Her fingers were pale, pale in the same way as Tommy's. The girl Mary inhaled sharply. Tommy's eyes widened. "Miss, are you all right?" The laundress looked at the children, her face hollow yet soft with concern. "You shouldn't be out here," she whispered. "Go home, quickly." "We can't leave the fire," Elsie insisted. "It keeps—" "Go," the laundress said again, her voice trembling. "Before it gets worse." "What gets worse?" Tommy asked. The laundress blinked, as though waking from a dream she wished she could forget. "Everything," she murmured. Then she staggered forward, gripping the wall to keep from falling. For a moment, the children saw her sleeve slip back, revealing pale patches spreading up her arm like frost climbing a window pane. Mary began to cry softly. Elsie tugged Tommy's sleeve. "We have to go. Now." Reluctantly, the children abandoned their little fire. scattering down the alley in different directions, disappearing into doorways and stairwells like frightened sparrows. Tommy lingered only a moment, staring at his pale hand, then at the woman disappearing into the fog. The fire sputtered, then died. The alley grew cold, and as Tommy ran, chest tight with fear he did not yet understand, the fog swallowed both his footsteps and the truth. The disease had reached the very heart of London's most vulnerable, and children too young to know its name, too old to pretend it wasn't real, were now carrying it home. Spitalfields Market had always been a place of noise, honest, chaotic noise that ran from dawn until the lamps were lit at dusk. Hawkers shouted prices with theatrical flair, costermongers rolled their carts over the uneven stones, buyers bargained with the desperation of the poor and the shrewdness of the wealthy. Even the pigeons were loud, scattering in frantic bursts whenever a crate toppled or a boy ran laughing through the stalls. But on the morning the panic began, the market woke strangely quiet. It wasn't silence, not quite. Stalls still opened, crates still landed with dull thuds, and vendors still arranged their goods beneath the canvas awnings. But there was an odd restraint to everything, as if the city had forgotten how to breathe properly. Conversations were softer, footsteps lighter. Every cough, no matter how innocent, drew a glance. Mrs. Havisham, who sold apples near the main entrance, sensed it immediately. She had been a vendor for 29 years and could read a crowd better than most men read a newspaper. That morning, she watched her customers approach her stall with their usual baskets and coins, but also with darting eyes, hesitant movements, and a peculiar urgency. "Apples, fresh apples," she called, though the cheer in her voice felt forced. A young woman stopped before her stall. Her hands, gloved despite the warming weather, trembled slightly as she picked through the fruit. When she finally chose 2 apples and reached for her purse, her glove slipped a fraction. Mrs. Havisham saw it. A pale mark blooming across the knuckles, smooth and white as candle wax. Her breath caught. She pretended not to notice, but the woman saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She withdrew her hand abruptly, dropping a coin on the counter before hurrying away, basket clutched to her chest. That was the moment the market began to unravel, because a butcher's boy near the fish stalls had seen the same pale patch earlier that morning on a man buying herring, his fingers trembling with numb indifference. Because a seamstress selling lace noticed that one of her regular customers kept the sleeves of her dress pulled unnaturally low, even as perspiration gathered at her brow. Because a fishmonger, running late, bumped into a stranger in the fog and felt nothing but cold through the fabric where their hands brushed. The rumors spread quickly. "Someone here's sick. Heard it's in Bishopsgate, and Whitechapel, and Holborn. They're bringing it here, they're bringing it to us." By mid-morning, buyers were rushing through the aisles instead of strolling. A dropped crate of oranges sent half a dozen customers stumbling away, convinced the sound signaled something worse. A woman fainted, overcome by fear, which only fueled more panic. Then Tommy Briggs, the boy from Hanbury Street, pale and shivering, wandered into the edge of the market. His small hand, with its ghostly patch, brushed against a table as he steadied himself. A chalk-white smear remained behind. A vendor screamed. It was not a loud scream, more a strangled gasp, but it was enough. Stalls were abandoned, carts overturned, produce scattered across the stones. A wave of bodies surged toward the street, baskets and purses forgotten, as though fleeing a fire. Mothers clutched their children close. Men pushed through the crowd with grim urgency. A constable shouted for calm, but his voice drowned in the rising tide of panic. Tommy shrank back against a stall, startled and terrified. He did not understand why everyone was running or why the air felt suddenly hostile. His breath came fast, shallow. "Boy," a voice called sharply. It was Mrs. Havisham. Her face was pale, but her resolve was solid. She knelt beside him, though she did not touch him. "You must go home," she said, breath trembling. "Quickly, before someone hurts you without meaning to." Tommy nodded and turned to run, but his knees buckled. Mrs. Havisham caught him with her apron, careful not to touch his skin. She steadied him gently, guiding him toward the street until he could move on his own. When he disappeared into the fog, the market was in ruins. What had been a bustling artery of London commerce had collapsed into chaos, all because of a rumour, a glimpse, a smear too pale to ignore. Mrs. Havisham stood amidst the overturned crates and scattered produce, her heart pounding. The market would recover. London always did. But something deeper had shifted. Something that could not be rebuilt with brooms and new stalls. Fear had found a place to root itself. And as the fog thickened, curling through the empty aisles like a living thing, Mrs. Havisham knew Spitalfields would not be the last place to fall silent. Not while the pale patches continued to spread. Not while London kept refusing to speak their name. At the far end of King Street, in a building draped with heavy velvet curtains and lit only by gas lamps that flickered like uncertain eyes, a committee gathered. Its members were men of influence and training doctors, city officials, and public health overseers, but tonight their power felt fragile, almost ceremonial. Outside, London's fog pressed against the windows, muting the sound of carriages and distant footsteps, creating the impression that the world beyond the room had been swallowed entirely. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, ink, and the faint metallic tang of antiseptics. Papers lay scattered across the table, reports from Mile End, letters from Islington, notes from Spitalfields. Each detailed the same strange phenomenon: pale patches, numb skin, waxy texture, and patients who did not flinch at pain. Each described individuals appearing in wards, boarding houses, and alleys, their existence half hidden, as if the city itself were conspiring to obscure the truth. Dr. Lionel Fenwick, whose hand still bore the faint tremor from his work in the Blue Bottle ward, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are facing something that cannot be dismissed with euphemisms. The reports indicate not isolated cases, but a pattern systematic, spreading, and insidious." A murmur of agreement passed around the table. One man, Dr. Colchester, adjusted his spectacles with a stiffness that betrayed his unease. "Yet we must not alarm the public," he said. "To print the truth now would incite panic beyond containment. The markets, the streets, even the docks, they cannot withstand hysteria." "The city is already uneasy," Dr. Whitcomb said quietly, leaning forward so that his voice barely reached the others over the hiss of the gas lamps. "Merely whispering nervous fever will not suffice. People are seeing what they must. They are afraid. We cannot legislate silence any longer." A gentleman from the Board of Health shifted uneasily. "Then what do you propose, Doctor? Shall we isolate every patient? Shut the city in? Send the poor away into quarantine that no one could maintain?" "Yes," Whitcomb said firmly, though his eyes darted to the shadowed corners of the room, as though expecting to see some unseen witness. "We must contain it quietly. A ward for observation, strict precautions, and limited access. Only those trained may enter. Any leakage of information, and the city could collapse under its own fear." The discussion grew tense. Each man weighed the responsibility lives versus the fragile reputation of London. Outside, the fog pressed against the windowpanes like a hand seeking entry. A faint tapping on the glass drew every eye. The city itself seemed to listen. Colonel Hargrave, a man tasked with oversight of civil compliance, cleared his throat. "Do we not risk creating monsters?" His voice carried more than hesitation. "Isolation without understanding might breed terror among the populace. Families could flee, spread the condition further, or abandon those who are already afflicted." Fenwick shook his head. "We have little choice. The disease, whatever its nature, spreads silently. By the time London acknowledges it publicly, containment will be impossible. The gas lamps guttered briefly, casting long, trembling shadows across the committee. Each man's face seemed altered by the wavering light, sharp angles softened into masks of fear. The papers on the table appeared to writhe, as if alive, under the lamplight. Colchester pressed his palms together. "Then we proceed," he said at last. "Discretion, above all. Observation, isolation, secrecy. We do not name it. Not now." A collective nod passed around the table, but agreement did not dissipate anxiety. The men rose, each taking their coat and hat, aware that London waited outside, oblivious yet watchful. They stepped into the fog, each breath visible, each footfall swallowed by the city's muted streets. And in the corridors of the Royal College, in the wards of Mile End, and in boarding houses and alleys across the city, the pale patches continued their silent work. London would not speak the name aloud, but the disease needed no announcement. It had already begun. Belgravia in the late afternoon was a careful sort of silence, one polished over years of marble steps, trimmed hedges, and whispers that carried from drawing rooms to the corners of shadowed streets. The sun, weak through London fog, scattered pale light across the grand facades of stuccoed houses, gilding nothing, softening everything. Yet inside one of these houses, in a room fragrant with lavender and the faint smoke of extinguished candles, the city's hidden fear pressed as sharply as any cold dense fog outside. Lady Evelina Harcourt sat upright on the chaise longue, gloved hands resting perfectly upon her lap. She had been expecting visitors for tea, a small gathering of friends and acquaintances, polite, controlled, and precisely punctual. But the day's mail had delivered something that pricked the edges of her composure. A note written in careful hand, folded thrice, bearing only these words: "Pale hands are moving through the city. Be vigilant." She did not recognize the handwriting, nor did she care to. The message's intention was clear enough. Panic or warning, she could not distinguish. Both felt equally cold against her skin. A servant entered, carrying a tray with porcelain teacups that clinked gently, unnervingly so in the silence of the room. Lady Evelina barely noticed. She traced the rim of her cup with her gloved fingers, sensing something unnatural in her own touch, a faint chill she could not explain. She pulled the glove slightly, flexing her fingers. Nothing felt wrong, yet something was wrong. She had read in the whispers of physicians, in the hushed words of attendants, that London was stirring with unease, that people were disappearing quietly, that a new sickness crept along the narrow alleys, soft and insidious. "Your ladyship," the servant said, voice careful. "A visitor at the door. She asks to see you immediately." Lady Evelina raised her eyebrows, aware that in polite society no one arrived without appointment, much less without consent. She sighed, lifting herself to her feet, the silken skirts of her gown rustling like the wind in autumn leaves. The visitor was a laundress from Stepney. Wet from the fog, shawl clutched close, gloves still pulled over hands that trembled despite the warmth of her cloak. The laundress curtsied with careful hesitation. "Lady Evelina," she began, voice low and strained, "please forgive my intrusion, but I am told you may wish to know of what is spreading among us. Among the children, the poor, the gentlefolk as well." The words carried the weight of something ancient, a caution whispered across decades of forgotten illnesses. Evelina felt her pulse quicken, despite the decorum she maintained so rigorously. She had seen pale hands before in passing, in rumour, in the soft reflections of lamplight on polished stone, but never so close, never spoken aloud. The laundress lifted a gloved hand. Evelina studied it, careful not to meet her gaze too fully. Beneath the thin fabric, the faintest patches of white traced the curve of her knuckles, smooth, cold, unfeeling. Evelina swallowed. "I understand," she said softly, keeping her voice calm. "Pray, sit. Tell me everything you know." The laundress did so, detailing the stories of alleyways, boarding houses, markets, and wards where children and adults alike had appeared with the same pale patches. She spoke of numbness, of waxen skin, of silent panic that rose faster than any visible infection. Lady Evelina listened, her gloved hands clenching and unclenching. Her drawing room, once a sanctuary of refinement, now seemed unbearably small, confined by invisible pressure. She imagined the fog pressing through the streets, carrying whispers, carrying disease, carrying fear. It was London itself that felt ill, not merely its people. When the laundress finished, Evelina rose and walked to the window, lifting the curtain slightly. The fog pressed against the glass, curling and writhing like a living thing. Outside, carriages moved slowly. Footsteps echoed in muted rhythm, and gas lamps flickered in tentative defiance. She turned to the laundress. "We must act with discretion," Evelina said, her voice resolute, "but also with vigilance. I will speak to my physicians, and I will see that those in danger, those touched by this affliction, are not abandoned." The laundress bowed deeply, gratitude and fear mingling in her glance. As she departed into the fog, Evelina remained by the window, gloved hands folded once more over her lap. She traced the pattern of the smears across the laundress's fingers in her mind, imagining the silent spread, the city holding its breath. And she understood, with a clarity that chilled her as deeply as any winter air. Belgravia would not be spared. London would not remain untouched. The pale hands were moving through every corner of the city, carrying with them the quiet dread of a disease that no one dared name aloud. The crematorium on Bow Road was a place that smelled faintly of smoke even before any fire had been lit. Its brick facade, blackened from decades of coal and soot, leaned into the street as though bearing the weight of sorrow itself. Gas lamps flickered along the perimeter, their halos dimmed by fog that had crept down from the Thames. The city's heartbeat, always uneven, always urgent, slowed within its walls, as if London itself paused in respect for the unseen toll it would collect inside. Inside, the air was heavy and warm, tinged with the smell of burning resin and the iron tang of the mortuary. Muffled footsteps echoed across stone floors, polished by decades of care, though no visitor could mistake the austerity of the place for comfort. Matron Briggs oversaw the schedule with meticulous precision, counting hours and bodies with an attention bordering on obsession. Today, like every day recently, she found herself adjusting the work to match the swelling demand. A clerk approached, carrying the day's report. His hands trembled slightly beneath the ledger, the ink smudged by damp gloves. "Matron," he said softly, "the cremations, they have exceeded the usual number, by 12, and more are expected by the evening." Briggs' lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we will work overtime," she said, though her voice lacked the usual authority, tinged instead with a quiet tension that only she could hear. "No bodies will be delayed, no families unattended." The clerk hesitated. "Matron, it is the pale cases, children, men, women, most of them not recorded in the city records." She nodded slowly, understanding without being told. London had learned to ignore them until the invisible burden became unavoidable. The crematorium, she thought grimly, was becoming the city's silent ledger. Outside, the fog pressed against the high windows, twisting and curling like smoke from the furnaces within. Occasionally, a distant bell tolled a church, a market, a private clock, yet its sound was swallowed almost instantly by the city's thick breath. In those tolls, Briggs imagined the heartbeat of London slowing, growing faint, leaving space for the creeping pallor of illness to move unseen. A stretcher arrived from Mile End Infirmary, bearing a young man whose hands were pale and smooth, the skin like polished wax. He had arrived quietly, attended by 2 nurses, whose eyes avoided him, as though the mere glance might transfer what he carried. Briggs noted the time, the condition, the pattern of markings. Each patient was a repetition of the same eerie choreography: numbness, pallor, silence. Families had been instructed to remain outside, their grief carefully measured, controlled. Some wept quietly on the fog-choked streets, hiding their despair beneath shawls and umbrellas. Others whispered prayers or muttered curses under their breath. But none entered the crematorium beyond the entry hall, where the clerks maintained the log, noting each body's arrival and the order of the furnace. The first fire was lit promptly. The flames roared quietly, restrained by the mechanics of careful design. Yet the heat pressed forward in a way that reminded Briggs of the urgency that had brought them here. She watched the smoke rise, twisting through the narrow chimney, disappearing into the thick London air. Each curl of smoke seemed a silent testament to the lives London preferred not to see, lives carried away with the faintest acknowledgement. By evening, more bodies had arrived than the day before. Children from the alleys, maids from the boarding houses, clerks from offices, street vendors, all bearing the same pale waxen patches that whispered their secrets without sound. The crematorium's fires roared in rhythm with the city's anxiety, consuming each in a manner both dignified and merciless. Briggs paused briefly in the shadowed corridor, inhaling the heat and acrid tang of smoke. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was not. The city beyond the walls had learned to whisper, but the crematorium could not. It bore the weight silently, consuming the evidence of fear and disease alike, leaving only smoke to rise through fog and lamplit streets. And somewhere in London, outside, in the alleys and markets, in Belgravia and Spitalfields, the pale hands moved onward, untouched by observation, undeterred by flame, carrying the quiet terror of a city that would not speak their name aloud. In the fog-wrapped streets of Clerkenwell, letters travelled like secrets born from uneasy hands. Messengers, hired by cautious families and whispered networks, delivered correspondence marked with a single word in bold, deliberate script: private. The envelopes were thick, cream-coloured, sealed with crimson wax that bore a familial crest, or the unmistakable emblem of discretion. Inside, folded sheets of paper contained news too fragile to speak aloud, truths too unsettling to trust to the air itself. Lady Evelina Harcourt received one such letter late in the afternoon, delivered by a young footman who hesitated on the polished steps of her Belgravia residence. He clutched the envelope tightly, as though afraid the very paper might reveal its contents before reaching her hands. She took it carefully, noting the unfamiliar handwriting, slanted, precise, and hurried. The wax seal was unbroken. Her drawing room, fragrant with lavender and the subtle smoke of extinguished candles, felt suddenly small and crowded. Even the faint sunlight, filtered through lace curtains, seemed diluted, weak against the weight pressing into her chest. She broke the seal slowly, unfolding the paper with gloved fingers, aware of the crisp sound it made. Each crease seemed amplified in the hush of the room. The words inside were measured, understated, yet they carried the chill of something ancient. A laundress from Stepney had been observed with the telltale patches, pale, smooth, numb. Others had been reported children in alleyways, servants in boarding houses, market vendors and clerks, all exhibiting the same silent symptoms. The letter emphasized discretion. The families mentioned in its lines had fled quietly, some for the countryside, some to lodgings unknown. No public alarm was raised. No word reached the press. Lady Evelina folded the letter back carefully, tracing the seal with her thumb. She felt a chill where the paper had brushed her skin. The words lingered in her mind, their meaning pressing against her thoughts like fog against windowpanes. She rang the bell for her secretary, a young man named Pritchard, and instructed him to prepare a response not to be sent publicly, but to be delivered with equal caution to the physician she trusted most. Dr. Fenwick, at Mile End Infirmary. Every phrase was chosen with care, a balance of urgency and restraint. "Dr. Fenwick," she wrote, "the situation is dire. Reports have reached my household of multiple cases bearing the same mysterious pallor and numbness. Families are fleeing in silence, and children have been observed with symptoms resembling those already noted in the East End. I entreat you to advise on measures for observation, containment, and care. Above all, discretion must be maintained." The letter sealed, she considered the weight it carried. London, for all its wealth, its sophistication, its polished streets and gilded corners, was suddenly smaller than she had ever realized. Invisible hands pressed against its pulse, moving silently through alleys, boarding houses, and market stalls, leaving traces only the cautious could recognize. The pale patches were no longer confined to whispers. They had begun to cross the boundaries of station, entering the realms of those who believed themselves insulated from the city's darker rhythms. She imagined the laundress walking back through fogged streets, shawl tight around her shoulders, gloved hands pressed to her chest. She imagined children clutching each other in alleys, faces pale, and eyes wide with unspoken understanding. She imagined servants hiding in kitchens and bedchambers, their fingers trembling under fabric that could not conceal the truth. Lady Evelina placed the letter atop her desk, its presence as heavy as the fog pressing against her windows. She looked out at the streets beyond, faintly visible through the lace, and wondered how long London could pretend the disease was not advancing through its veins. How long before whispers became cries, before private letters became public warnings, before the city could no longer shield itself from what walked quietly among its populace. Her gloved fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. London had begun to tremble, and nothing, not etiquette, not wealth, not secrecy, would stop it from feeling the touch of the pale hands moving unseen through its streets. Kensal Green Cemetery was a city of silence. Its tombs and gravestones rose from the fog like solemn sentinels, cold and patient, marking decades of lives that had passed quietly into the earth. The air carried the faint odor of damp soil and decaying leaves, mingled with the distant clatter of carriage wheels from streets beyond the high walls. At night, the mist thickened, curling through the avenues between monuments, carrying with it a sense of reverence and dread alike. It was here, in the earliest hour of morning, that the laundress from Stepney was brought for her burial. Her body had been wrapped carefully in linens, treated with carbolic, placed in a coffin lined with antiseptic cloths, all measures taken to guard against the silent, creeping disease that had claimed her skin. The officials had insisted the funeral be conducted with the utmost discretion, a ceremony stripped of ceremony, with only those strictly necessary permitted to attend. A small contingent of attendants carried the coffin along the damp gravel paths, their boots muffled against the stones. The fog pressed against them, cold and unyielding, blurring the outlines of angels and crosses carved into the headstones. They moved with the quiet precision of those accustomed to bearing heavy truths. Even the air seemed to hush itself, as though London itself were holding its breath. The mourners were few. A matron from the infirmary, her face drawn and pale, kept her eyes fixed on the coffin. A clerk from the Blue Bottle ward followed, clutching a ledger like a talisman. Reverend Whitcomb stood a few paces behind, his voice subdued, murmuring prayers in tones that trembled between hope and fear. There was no music, no lamentations, only the faint rustle of garments and the sighing wind weaving through the stones. The coffin was lowered with care into its grave. The earth, wet from the winter fog, clung to the wooden sides, sucking the sound of the creaking ropes into a damp silence. The matron placed her hands briefly on the lid, fingers gloved yet trembling, and whispered, "Rest now," quietly, away from prying eyes. For a moment, a bird cawed somewhere beyond the cemetery walls, startling the mourners with a sharp note that seemed almost obscene against the weight of the morning. But the wind carried it away, scattering it through the fog, leaving only the hushed city behind. The Reverend stepped forward, reciting blessings that felt too fragile for the reality they attempted to sanctify. His words hung in the air, absorbed by the fog, carried along the avenues between gravestones, touching the faces of the living in the alleys beyond the walls. The faintest whisper of the phrase, "May she be spared," lingered, but there was no certainty in it. London had learned that mercy was not guaranteed, especially when the invisible threat walked unseen through its streets. The attendants shoveled the soil with care, each handful a solemn rhythm, the sound muted against the thick fog. It was methodical, almost ritualistic, the way one might prepare for a storm that had already arrived in spirit. The earth covered her slowly, deliberately, as if the city itself wished to conceal the evidence of its fear. When the grave was filled, a small, pale patch of grass bent under the weight of dew. No flowers were laid, no ribbons tied. Only the cold mist remained, pressing against the coffin, curling around the mourners, and spilling outward into the streets, where London had begun its quiet, trembling acknowledgement of the disease. As the group departed, the fog thickened, swallowing their footprints. Children played in the alleys unaware, hawkers began to set up stalls in Spitalfields, and London exhaled the usual sounds of industry and commerce. Yet beneath the clatter, beneath the fog, the city felt different. The laundress rested in her grave, and London, polite, proud, and unaware, held its breath. The pale hands that had taken her remained at large, moving silently through alleys, boarding houses, and markets, carrying the quiet dread that no coffin could contain. The city had buried her, yes, but it had not buried the fear. Mr. Edwin Marbury's shop on Lamb's Conduit Street smelled, as always, of herbs, ink, and faintly acrid antiseptics. But in recent weeks, the air had taken on a different quality, a tension, invisible yet palpable, that pressed against the glass jars and polished counters like fog against the city streets. Londoners had begun to whisper in hushed tones, and Marbury had learned that curiosity often travelled faster than propriety. He had prepared a small tonic in secret, a pale blue mixture whose ingredients were borrowed from old colonial treatises and his own cautious experimentation. Carbolic, copper salts, and a tincture of rare minerals blended into a liquid that gleamed unnaturally under the lamplight, as if it carried a faint inner pulse. He had called it nothing, refused even to name it aloud. It was for emergencies, for cases too fragile to discuss in public, for hands pale and numb in ways that ordinary ailments could not explain. The first customer arrived just after the lamps flickered on. She was a laundress, gloves pulled high, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her eyes darted nervously at the door, the counter, even at Marbury himself. "I heard," she whispered, "that you might have something for it." Marbury's pulse quickened, though his voice remained calm. "What do you mean?" Her gloved hand trembled as she withdrew it. Beneath, the pale patch gleamed under the lantern light, smooth and unfeeling. She had heard rumors, of course, of wards and secret funerals, of whispers in alleys and boarding houses, but she had no other recourse. "It spreads," she murmured, "and I don't want to disappear." Marbury nodded slowly, producing a small vial from beneath the counter. Its liquid caught the light, turning cobalt in the faint glow. He handed it to her carefully. "This may help. Apply a few drops to the affected area, gently, only gently, and do not speak of it to anyone, not your family, not your neighbors, not even friends you trust." The laundress nodded, clutching the vial as though it were both a lifeline and a burden. She left quickly, disappearing into the fog that had begun to roll in heavier than usual, curling around the edges of the shop. Within the hour, 2 more visitors arrived. Both were children of merchants from Spitalfields, sent by mothers who had heard whispers of pale hands, of numbness, of invisible contagion. Marbury treated them with the same care, handing each a tiny blue vial and instructing secrecy. By nightfall, his shelves had been disturbed, his ledger filled with hurried notations, customer names, addresses, doses provided, observations of the spread. Each line in the ledger carried weight, a record of desperation moving quietly through London. Marbury poured himself a cup of tea, its warmth failing to reach the chill in his bones. The blue bottle sat beside him, glowing faintly in the lamplight, a beacon of hope, yet also of responsibility. He had seen the diseases advance through alleys, through boarding houses, even within drawing rooms in Belgravia, and understood that the tonic was a stopgap, a fragile defense against a tide that would not be halted by chemistry alone. Outside, the fog wrapped the streets in silver-grey silence. He imagined the laundress applying the drops, the children obeying their mother's instructions, the pale hands moving quietly from person to person. London went about its business, unaware of the invisible tide, while fear travelled faster than news, faster than gossip, faster than prudence. Marbury lifted the blue bottle carefully, turning it in his hands. The liquid sloshed faintly, catching the lamplight in a way that made it seem almost alive. He whispered under his breath, "May it be enough." The city slept, unaware. The fog pressed against the windows, carrying distant echoes of footsteps and carts. But in the hearts of those touched, and in the secret ledger of the apothecary, a quiet dread lingered. The pale hands continued their work, moving silently through London's streets, indifferent to wealth, status, or propriety. And the blue bottle, Mr. Marbury's tempting cure, was all that stood between them and a disease that no one dared name aloud. The ward had no name. It existed in the infirmary at Mile End, not on any map, not on any ledger, accessible to casual visitors. It was a narrow, dimly lit chamber at the far end of the east wing, where the air was heavier and colder than the rest of the building, and where silence lingered like a tangible thing. The walls, once whitewashed, had taken on the muted grey of years of damp, fog, and neglect. Only the occasional glint of brass fixtures and the muted flicker of a single lamp punctuated the shadows. It was here that patients touched by the disease were placed. They did not speak much, for speech seemed to demand sensation they no longer possessed. Their hands pale, waxy, unfeeling rested against linen, railings, and blankets without the slightest acknowledgement. Their skin was smooth, luminous in the lamplight, as if polished by invisible hands. They were watched constantly, their movements catalogued, their diets measured, their linens changed with fastidious precision. Yet despite all care, each patient exuded a quiet desperation that no doctor or nurse could soothe. Mrs. Agatha Brindle, matron of the infirmary, moved among the beds with the practiced calm of someone who had seen countless illnesses, countless deaths, countless quiet tragedies. Yet even she felt unease in this particular ward. It was not only the disease itself, the pale patches, the numbness, the slow, creeping spread, but the silence, the absence of normal human responses. Patients no longer cried when in pain. They no longer flinched. They existed in a liminal state, neither fully alive in sensation, nor yet departed from the world. A young woman, formerly a laundress from Stepney, sat upright in her bed, her gloved hands pressed lightly against the blanket. When Mrs. Brindle approached, she looked up with eyes wide and blank, as though trying to see something beyond the walls of the ward. The matron knelt beside her, adjusting the blankets with gentle hands, careful not to touch her skin. "Rest," she whispered. "The night is quiet here. You are safe." The patient nodded faintly, though there was no warmth in the gesture. In the corner, an older man rocked slightly in his chair, staring at the wall. He had arrived earlier in the week, and already the pallor had spread from his fingertips up to his elbows. He did not respond to questions. He did not respond to touch. He seemed to exist solely within the rhythms of the infirmary, the hum of lamps, the shifting of staff, the distant toll of bells outside. Even Nurse Hartley, who had grown accustomed to the oddities of this illness, felt a chill in the room that no lamp could dispel. She moved quickly, changing linens, delivering food, and noting the precise positioning of each patient's limbs. Everything was catalogued, everything was measured, everything was controlled. Yet control did not dispel the sense of creeping inevitability. Outside, the fog pressed against the high windows of the infirmary, curling around them like a living thing, carrying with it the distant cries of the city. A child weeping, a cart scraping the cobblestones, a bell tolling faintly in the distance. Within the ward, the faint hum of lamps, the soft rustle of linen, and the slow, mechanical movements of staff created a rhythm almost indistinguishable from breath. The matron paused by a bed, observing a small hand tremble slightly against the blanket despite its numbness. She traced the curve of the pale patch in her mind, noting the progress of the disease, the way it seemed to move almost deliberately across skin. Each patient was alone, yet all shared the same fate, the same silent isolation. Mrs. Brindle straightened, gloved hands folded over her apron. She knew the ward could not hold them forever. The city beyond would eventually press against the walls, demanding recognition of what lived quietly within. But for tonight, for this hour, they remained here, invisible, unfeeling, unwanted, yet carefully preserved from the eyes of a world that did not yet wish to see. And as the fog thickened against the windows, as gas lamps flickered uncertainly, the ward exhaled its quiet despair, a pulse of solitude carried into the damp London night. Inspector Henry Carlyle had walked the streets of London for over 20 years, learning their language in the rhythm of footfalls and the scuff of boots against cobblestones. He knew when a cart had passed recently, when a child had run through an alley, when a dog had been abandoned in the rain. Yet in all his experience, never had he felt a tension so thick that it seemed to cling to the very bricks and mortar, a presence that whispered beneath his every step. The fog that evening was nearly impenetrable. Gas lamps glowed dimly, casting halos that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Cobblestones glistened with the damp of an unrelenting mist, slick and treacherous beneath his polished boots. Carlyle moved with deliberate care, baton in hand, eyes scanning the alleyways and narrow passageways that threaded through the city like veins carrying its unseen heartbeat. He had been called to Spitalfields Market, where panic had taken hold among merchants and buyers alike. Rumours of pale hands and numb skin had circulated, and the inspector's duty was to observe, record, and, where possible, maintain order. But as he walked among the scattered crates and abandoned baskets, he realized that disorder was not his only adversary. There was a quietness in the market that defied explanation, a pause in the city's usual clamor that felt almost unnatural. A vendor approached him hesitantly, his voice low and tremulous. "Inspector, it's spreading. I saw a boy just now, his hand pale like wax." He touched a crate, and the mark remained. Carlyle nodded slowly, noting the vendor's fear as though it were evidence in itself. "Which way did he go?" "Down the alley," the man replied. I didn't follow. Afraid I might catch it." His words faltered. Carlyle clenched his jaw. Fear was everywhere. It had begun to shape the behavior of the city, constricting its movement, infecting its very air. And yet, the disease itself remained unseen, moving silently through the population, leaving only traces too subtle for most to recognize. He turned into the alley, careful to avoid debris, puddles, and the glancing shadows cast by flickering lamps. The fog thickened, curling against the walls and climbing the narrow stairways of tenements. Somewhere a child whimpered. A dog barked once, then went silent. Carlyle's breath rose in pale clouds. Each step echoed unnaturally, magnified in the muted air. At the far end, he spotted the boy mentioned by the vendor. He was crouched beside a pile of crates, fingers pressed against a splintered wood surface. The skin on his hand gleamed unnaturally pale, smooth, almost luminous against the dim light. Carlyle recognized it instantly, the same symptoms described in the hospital reports, in the whispered letters of concerned families, in every shadowed corner where fear had taken root. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide, unblinking, and did not move. Carlyle approached cautiously, keeping his distance. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said softly. "Do you know where your family is?" The child shook his head. They left. They said, "Don't touch me." His voice was small, trembling. Carlyle took a deep breath. "Then I will escort you to someone who can care for you." The boy nodded, glancing once at his pale hand. It flexed slowly, unnaturally, showing no response to muscle or sensation. Carlyle's pulse quickened. He had seen fear before, but this was different. The disease did not cry, did not flinch. It moved quietly, invisibly, infecting the city's rhythm, shaping behavior before anyone understood its presence. He guided the boy through the alleyways, past shuttered shops and silent tenements. The fog pressed against them from every side, curling through the narrow streets as though the city itself were watching, measuring, withholding judgment. Carlyle felt the weight of London pressing in, sensing the inevitability that would follow. More children, more alleys, more fear that moved faster than medicine, faster than reason, faster than anyone dared speak aloud. By the time they reached the infirmary, the pale hands had already touched countless surfaces unseen, and Carlyle understood that the streets he had walked for decades now belonged not to the living alone, but to something quiet, persistent, and unstoppable. The city's rhythm had changed. Its pulse had slowed, and the inspector, for all his experience, could not yet know how many more would fall under the touch of the invisible threat he had spent his life trying to understand. Miss Clara Whitby had been a governess in Belgravia for scarcely a year, yet she had already learned the delicate balance of obedience and discretion required by London's upper houses. She moved with careful steps along polished floors, her skirts rustling softly, hands gloved even indoors, and her eyes alert to every subtle shift in expression. In the course of her duties, she had witnessed illnesses, fainting spells, and nervous hysteria. She had attended children in fevers, whispered reassurances to anxious mothers, and soothed those who bore invisible burdens. Yet, nothing had prepared her for what she had seen in the alleyways, the boarding houses, and the private wards in recent weeks. It was during the late afternoon, in the quiet hush between lessons and supper, that Clara first felt the weight of the unseen terror pressing upon her. She had been supervising the youngest children in the drawing room when a letter arrived, hastily delivered by a footman whose face betrayed both fear and uncertainty. The envelope bore no name but was sealed with dark crimson wax, the impression of a crest, unfamiliar, yet undeniably authoritative. Inside were brief lines penned in careful, urgent script, warnings of pallid hands, numbness creeping through servants and street children alike, whispers of a sickness that spared no district Stepney, Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and now, seemingly, the very houses of Belgravia. The letter urged caution, secrecy, and the avoidance of contact with any who displayed these pale, unfeeling marks. Miss Whitby felt her stomach tighten. She glanced at the children under her care, their small faces bright with the innocence of ignorance, untouched by fear or knowledge. The very thought that they might already have brushed against someone afflicted sent a shiver through her spine. She had learned in her brief tenure that appearances could not be trusted, quiet hands might conceal horror, polite manners might mask contagion, and she realized with chilling clarity that the city itself was failing to protect the most vulnerable. By evening, she had made a decision. She would leave. Not boldly, not with announcement, but quietly, under the guise of an errand. slipping from the household with only what she could carry. She packed a small satchel with essentials, a change of clothing, her letters, a small purse, and gloves, always gloves. She did not take money beyond a modest sum. She had little faith that commerce would remain trustworthy in the city's shifting shadows. The streets were thick with fog as she stepped from the carriage into the alleys of Whitechapel. Gas lamps flickered, casting distorted shapes on the walls, and the uneven cobblestones glistened with damp. Clara moved swiftly, head bowed, eyes sharp, keeping to the shadows where she could. She passed a figure in a doorway, a boy, crouched, pale hand pressed against a crate. She recognized the symptom instantly, though she had seen it only in letters, whispered accounts, and fleeting glimpses from windows. Waxy, smooth, numb skin. Her breath caught. She adjusted her satchel against her shoulder and pressed onward, careful not to touch anything, careful not to be touched. A carriage rattled past, splashing mud onto the stones, but no one noticed her. In the fog, the city seemed both empty and full of silent watchers. Every shadow might conceal the afflicted. Every lamp might reveal them. Clara's pulse raced, yet she forced her steps to remain steady, rhythmic, obedient to her own sense of purpose, escape, safety, distance. By midnight, she had reached the outskirts of the city, where the fog thinned enough to allow for direction. She paused briefly, hand pressed against her chest, gloves covering the tips of her fingers that she feared might already carry traces of what London refused to name. She realized the full weight of her isolation, the houses she left behind, the children she might never see again, the servants whose hands she had once guided, now vulnerable to what stalked the streets. Clara drew a deep breath and stepped forward. London slept or pretended to, but she knew better. The pale hands moved silently, methodically, touching doors, railings, and those too innocent or too trusting to avoid contact. She had escaped this house, this street, this district, but the city itself had not escaped the shadow it carried. Her footsteps carried her into the night, away from the city's grandeur and its hidden horrors, and yet she knew that the illness, the fear, and the pallor of its touch would continue to move silently through the heart of London, long after she had vanished into the fog. The Thames moved slowly that evening, its dark surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a passing barge or the subtle sway of a moored boat. Fog hovered low, clinging to the river like a shroud, curling around the pilings and spilling over the docks, swallowing lamp-posts, crates, and weary figures alike. The river had always been a lifeline for London, carrying goods, coal, letters, and bodies. Tonight, it carried something else, something quieter, heavier, that no one could see but all could feel. Along the banks, the warehouses loomed like silent witnesses. Smoke from chimneys mingled with the fog, producing a haze that smelled faintly of salt, soot, and decay. The docks were mostly empty now. The workers had retreated to inns and homes, leaving only the occasional night watchman to patrol the creaking gangplanks. But the river was busy with another traffic, subtle, unseen. Whispers of pallid hands, of numb skin, of illness carried through touch, air, and proximity, moving invisibly from one borough to another. In the heart of Whitechapel, Mrs. Havisham, the market vendor, watched from a doorway as her remaining customers scurried home. The boy with the chalk-white hand had vanished, leaving behind only the memory of a smear on her stall. She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter, aware that the pale touch had already passed to others. Even the river's mist seemed complicit, carrying the unseen burden into the city's arteries, flowing past alleys, streets, and tenements like a quiet tide of dread. On the south bank, a group of children emerged from the alleyways, their hands unwashed, their faces pale in the lantern light. Some clutched siblings or friends, others moved alone, drawn by instinct and curiosity. They had seen the patches, felt the absence of sensation in their own touch, and now carried it unknowingly, tracing invisible lines through London's streets. Every step they took was another transmission, every innocent brush against wood or fabric, a silent act of spreading. Upstream, a laundress walked briskly along the quay, carrying a small bundle of linens wrapped carefully to avoid contact. She paused to peer over the river, imagining the flow of the water as a mirror for the disease moving unseen through the city. Each ripple reminded her of the uncounted victims, servants, children, merchants, clerks, whose hands had grown pale, smooth, numb. London would not know the full scope of the sickness until it had already passed through the veins of the city, leaving only shadows and whispers behind. Dr. Fenwick, standing near the infirmary wharf, watched the river with an anxious eye. The blue bottle rested in his coat pocket, a fragile shield against something that was not yet fully understood. He had treated the laundress, the children, the pale men and women who had appeared at the edge of wards, yet he knew the tonic could do only so much. The disease moved faster than medicine, more silently than observation, and more invisibly than fear itself. A small boat drifted by, carrying coal and refuse, the river swallowing the sound of its oars. Fenwick imagined the countless surfaces it touched, the unseen particles it carried, the invisible trail extending into alleys, docks, and homes. The river, once a source of commerce and sustenance, now bore witness to the quiet advance of London's hidden terror. By midnight, the banks were empty save for the occasional lamplit figure. The fog thickened, curling over the water, obscuring even the outlines of the warehouses. Somewhere along the northern quay, a small figure paused, glanced at the river, and then pressed gloved fingers to pale, unfeeling hands. The Thames carried the rest cargo, refuse, rumours, and perhaps even the essence of the disease itself slipping silently through London's arteries, untouched by the city's vigilance, ignored by its pride. And as the water flowed under bridges, past warehouses, and into the heart of the metropolis, it reminded those few who dared notice that some things cannot be contained, cannot be named, and cannot be ignored. London slept fitfully that night. The river kept its secret, and the pale hands continued their work, moving quietly, methodically, leaving whispers and tremors in their wake. The city, polished and oblivious, had no choice but to breathe alongside the unseen tide. The streets of London were perpetually damp, even when the rain had long since ceased. Gas lamps glimmered faintly through the mist, casting a pallid light across wet cobblestones and the uneven faces of buildings that had stood for centuries. It was a city in motion, yet suspended, each breath heavy with soot, coal, and an intangible tension that the poor had long learned to sense. The wealthy, however, preferred to ignore it, and the city's leaders often looked away, assuming that administration and decorum could contain what lurked in alleys and tenements. But the sanitary crusaders did not look away. They were a collection of men and women armed with clipboards, pamphlets, and the fervent certainty that cleanliness could restore the moral and physical order of the metropolis. Doctors and reformers, chemists and journalists, each believed that intervention, meticulous observation, and public regulation could stave off disaster. The pale hands of the afflicted had not gone unnoticed. The whisper of an illness too quiet to sound an alarm, yet too precise to ignore, had reached the ears of those committed to the city's health. Dr. Percival Armitage, a leader among the Crusaders, walked briskly along Whitechapel Road with a small delegation of assistants. They carried bottles of carbolic, measuring instruments, notebooks filled with careful notations. Every doorway, every alley, every drain was scrutinized. Armitage moved with the assured stride of a man who believed in purpose, though even he could not dispel the shiver that traced his spine when he glimpsed the signs. A hand withdrawn too hastily, a glove worn indoors, a child moving with uncanny stillness. "Do you see it?" he asked quietly, indicating a set of footprints that stopped abruptly near a doorway. One assistant knelt, brushing damp mud aside. "The prints," They vanish suddenly. No continuation down the alley. Armitage's eyes narrowed, as if the person disappeared into the fog itself. Record the location. Not for public dissemination yet. Every day, the Crusaders collected evidence, catalogued anomalies, and tried to interpret what the city's inhabitants could not articulate. Tenements were inspected, kitchens examined, alleyways measured and mapped. Yet the more they observed, the more they realized that London was moving against them. Rumors and panic had already begun to take root. Families fled quietly, markets closed early, and children vanished from their usual play spots. The disease did not need to announce itself. It had infiltrated every corner, riding on hands, fabric, and breath alike. At a meeting in a small room lined with chemical charts and pamphlets, Armitage addressed his colleagues. Cleanliness alone will not suffice. We must combine observation with containment, education with discretion. The public must remain calm, or all efforts will fail. A young assistant, eager but pale-faced, raised a hand. "Sir, the case is in the boarding houses. Should we not alert families? Notify them of the risk?" Armitage shook his head slowly. "Alerting them too soon will cause panic. Panic is worse than the illness. It spreads faster than any hand or fabric." He gestured toward the charts. "Instead, we observe. We intervene silently. We contain. And above all, we document every trace, every pale hand, every numb patch, every silent victim." Outside, fog pressed against the windows, curling in like a living thing, carrying distant sounds of footsteps, carts, and children playing obliviously. Every alley might conceal the afflicted. Every home might harbor a secret. And London, unaware, continued its habitual breathing, unaware that the very city itself had become a laboratory for fear, observation, and control. As the Crusaders left the room, bottles in hand, notebooks clutched to chests, and lanterns casting wavering shadows, the streets awaited them silently. They were armed with knowledge, yet the invisible foe moved faster, quieter, and more deliberately than any human could predict. And in every alley and tenement, pale hands continued their quiet work, touching surfaces, children and adults alike, spreading uncertainty and dread through the heart of London. The city would soon discover that even the most meticulous of sanitary crusades could not outrun the creeping shadow that had claimed the hands, the skin, and the silence of its people. The infirmary at Mile End had always been a place of meticulous order, its walls polished, its wards numbered and catalogued with care. Yet tucked at the far end of the East Wing lay a room that existed in deliberate ambiguity, a ward whose patients were recorded under no clear name, their conditions described only in faint, cautious phrases: cutaneous anomalies, neural degeneration, unusual pallor. Staff whispered about it, outsiders ignored it, and doctors documented it in careful Latin to avoid recognition outside the walls. Here, in this ward, the disease of pale hands, waxen skin, and unfeeling flesh moved quietly, claiming its victims without announcement. Dr. Lionel Fenwick stepped into the dim corridor, lantern in hand. The air smelled faintly of carbolic, antiseptic, and damp stone. Each step echoed on the polished floors, reverberating against walls lined with narrow windows that pressed against the fog-laden streets outside. Inside the ward, the patients lay in their beds, silent, still, each one exhibiting the same unnerving characteristics. Some were children, small and pale, clutching worn blankets as though they might ward off the invisible presence. Others were adults, servants, clerks, laundresses, whose hands rested limp against linen, entirely unaware of the numbness that had claimed them. Fenwick paused at the bedside of a young laundress from Stepney. Her gloved hands were folded neatly on her chest, though he had instructed her to remove them earlier. She obeyed now, slowly, revealing the smooth, pale patch that covered her palm and the inner curve of her wrist. The skin reflected the lantern's light in a ghostly sheen, as though polished by a spectral hand. Fenwick's pulse quickened. He had seen these symptoms before in letters, in whispers, in fleeting glimpses, but never together in one patient so fully. "Are you in discomfort?" he asked softly. She shook her head. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound emerged. She had not learned how to articulate pain that did not exist. Fenwick made notes in the ledger beside her bed, careful to avoid repetition, yet thorough enough to capture every detail. Fingers flexing, patches spreading, the subtle loss of sensation across her forearm, her elbows, the faint blush that occasionally appeared along the wrists. He recorded her respiration, the slight quiver of eyelids, and the absence of any flinch when he touched her skin. Everything was meticulous, methodical, clinical, but his mind raced with a rising dread. Nearby, a child shivered under a coarse blanket, eyes wide and unblinking. Fenwick noted the pallor of the skin, the numbness in the fingers, the lack of reaction to the faintest stimulus. He glanced at Nurse Hartley, who moved silently from bed to bed, adjusting linens and checking temperatures with the precision of one who had long mastered the art of quiet observation. She met his gaze briefly, her eyes reflecting the same unspoken fear. Outside the ward, the fog pressed against the windows with a damp insistence, curling around the edges as if eager to witness the quiet ritual within. Each patient, confined to a bed, a blanket, and a listless awareness of their surroundings, seemed to breathe in tandem with the city's hush. London continued its routines, footsteps echoing faintly along cobblestones, carts rattling over wet streets, distant bells tolling, but the pulse of the metropolis had slowed within these walls. Fenwick recorded each detail carefully, knowing that knowledge alone could not prevent the spread. Treatments were tentative, experimental, delicate. The blue bottle, the carbolic salves, the tinctures he had prepared, all were insufficient to halt the advance. The illness moved faster than observation, swifter than understanding, and yet entirely silent. He closed the ledger with a soft snap. Each patient lay still, unaware of the peril beyond the walls. Fenwick stepped back into the corridor, lantern swinging slightly in his hand. The ward remained silent, its occupants motionless, yet heavy with the weight of the unknown. And outside, London pressed against the windows, ignorant of the disease that moved among its citizens with quiet determination. Its victims recorded only as unnamed, its presence recognized only by the faintest patch of pale, waxen skin. The quarantine house stood at the edge of Mile End, its brick walls blackened with soot, windows tall and narrow, and gates iron-wrought with rust creeping along every joint. It was a building the city had constructed in haste during the last wave of epidemic fever, meant to contain what could not yet be explained, to isolate what could not yet be cured. Now, in the grip of fog so dense it seemed almost alive, the house waited quietly, its shadowed corridors stretching inward like the fingers of some slumbering sentinel. Inside, the hallways smelled of carbolic and damp wood, the air thick with a metallic tang that stung faintly at the throat. Lanterns were placed at intervals, their light struggling against the gloom, casting long, uncertain shadows that trembled along the walls. The patients who had been brought here moved quietly, shuffled by attendants who spoke in hushed tones and wore gloves at all times. Every step, every gesture, was calculated to avoid contact with surfaces that might already be tainted. A young laundress, recently transported from the East End, sat on a narrow cot near the window. Her hands, pale and smooth as polished ivory, rested atop the coarse blanket. She did not flinch as Nurse Hartley brushed lint from her sleeve or adjusted the folds of her clothing. Sensation had abandoned her slowly, beginning in the fingers and spreading with cruel deliberation up her arms, across her wrists, to her elbows. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared toward the fogged glass, watching shadows move outside without comprehension of their meaning. Matron Brindle moved among the beds with a careful efficiency, inspecting each patient in turn. Her gloves were white, her movements precise, her eyes sharp. She recorded temperatures, adjusted pillows, replaced linens, and catalogued every pale hand and waxen patch. The air was heavy with the quiet dread that accompanied the disease. There were no cries, no protests, no gestures of discomfort beyond the faintest tremors that might have been imagined. And yet, the weight of their presence pressed upon the room, pressing against walls, floor, and ceiling alike. At the far end of the ward, a small boy rocked slightly on his cot. His mother had been too frightened to accompany him, leaving him in the hands of the hospital alone. His fingers were numb and pallid, the skin smooth to the touch, reflecting the lantern's light like porcelain. Each movement was hesitant, mechanical, as though he were learning how to exist in a body that no longer obeyed. Nurse Hartley noted the progress silently, adjusting blankets and recording details in her ledger. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. The distant clang of a bell echoed faintly, muted by the thickness of the mist. Somewhere in the streets beyond, Londoners hurried home, unaware that the disease had claimed its quiet spaces, moving unnoticed, leaving traces only those trained to observe could detect. The quarantine house, constructed for containment, now served as a repository of fear and isolation. It held the afflicted in a suspended state, neither fully part of the city nor fully separate from it. Matron Brindle paused at the window, gloved fingers resting lightly against the sill. She surveyed the fogged streets, imagining the pale hands moving silently through alleys, boarding houses, and markets. She understood that this house, no matter how fortified, could not halt the disease's advance beyond its walls. London itself had become the conduit for the illness, carrying it through commerce, through touch, and through the unwitting hands of children and servants alike. As the lanterns flickered and shadows shifted across the narrow corridors, the matron stepped back into the ward. She adjusted a patient's blanket, made notes in her ledger, and whispered reassurances she knew were insufficient. The quarantine house, she realized, was only a temporary measure, a fragile bulwark against a tide that no door, no wall, and no secrecy could ultimately contain. The fog thickened outside, curling around the brick facade, swallowing the street. Inside, the patients lay silent, unmoving, their pale hands resting atop blankets, awaiting a city that did not yet comprehend the quiet invasion moving through every corner of London. In a narrow street of Clerkenwell, lined with brick townhouses whose chimneys exhaled faint wisps of smoke, a household disappeared almost entirely in the night. The Harrington family, a respectable couple with 2 children, had been known for their careful adherence to social proprieties, their polished manners, and the pristine condition of their home. Neighbors noted the quiet rhythms of daily life, curtains drawn at the same hour, doors locked and unlocked with measured precision, the faint clatter of boots along the hallways. Nothing about the family invited scrutiny, and yet their absence would become the whisper that haunted the neighborhood for weeks. It began the evening before, with a subtle unease. Mrs. Harrington had received a letter, sealed, discreet, urgent. The note contained warnings of pale hands, of numbness creeping across skin with silent inevitability, of servants, children, and market-goers alike, touched by the disease that no one dared name aloud. Though written in careful hand, the words carried weight enough to chill her spine. She glanced at her children, their cheeks rosy from the late afternoon sun, unaware of the city's invisible danger pressing ever closer. By nightfall, the family began a quiet, deliberate evacuation. Servants moved under whispered instructions, carrying what possessions they could, carefully avoiding surfaces that might have been touched by the invisible contagion. Gloves were worn even indoors, shawls pulled tight, and hats angled low to obscure features from any prying eyes that might glance from nearby windows. No candle was left burning, no lamp alight in the hallways. London itself seemed to hold its breath as they moved silently from room to room, packing essentials, guiding children, and slipping away through back passages unknown to the casual observer. At dawn, the street was empty of life. Doors remained closed, shutters tight, curtains hung undisturbed, betraying no movement within. Neighbors, arriving to their routines, first noticed an unusual stillness. The scent of cooked meals that usually greeted them at morning hour was absent. The echo of children's laughter, once faint through the brick walls, had vanished. By mid-morning, whispers began to circulate. The Harringtons have left, vanished, gone, in the night. No note was left, no explanation given. Only the faintest trace of hurried activity lingered in the dust along the threshold, footprints too small to belong to the street's adult residents, a scuffed stair tread, a glove misplaced on the landing. It was as if the household had evaporated, leaving behind only the residue of careful movement. The pallor of fear, the kind that had begun to creep through London quietly, invisibly, was now visible in the nervous exchanges between neighbors. Across town, similar vanishings were reported. Families in Islington, maids from Stepney, children from Spitalfields. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern: private, rapid, silent, and almost imperceptibly deliberate. Those left behind speculated in hushed tones. Some blamed sudden illness, others the city's crime, and a few, more daring, whispered of the mysterious disease whose name was never spoken aloud. By nightfall, Clerkenwell felt different. The familiar rhythm of daily life had been broken. Doorways and windows bore an unnatural quiet. Streets were lighter in traffic, heavier in apprehension. The fog pressed closer to the walls, curling and thickening like a living thing, carrying whispers, shadows, and the subtle scent of carbolic from distant infirmaries. And in their absence, the Harrington family had become part of the city's invisible ledger, a record of fear, precaution, and survival written not in ink but in the hush of empty rooms, the echo of abandoned footsteps, and the unspoken understanding that London itself had begun to acknowledge the invisible hand of its unseen adversary. The family had vanished, yes, but the shadow of what had touched them, silent, pale, and relentless, remained. And as London exhaled fog over cobblestones and alleys, that shadow pressed onward, uncontained, moving quietly from one household to the next. In the lecture hall of the Royal College, the air was thick with the scent of ink, soot, and the faint tang of antiseptics that clung even in the absence of open bottles. Outside, fog pressed against the tall windows, curling around the stone columns and dimly illuminating the faces of those gathered inside. The men seated at the long oak benches were physicians of some standing, learned, precise, accustomed to authority, but tonight the usual discipline had unravelled, replaced by tension as taut as the strings of a violin on the verge of snapping. Dr. Colchester rose, adjusting his spectacles with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from age, fatigue, or unease, no one could say. "Gentlemen," he began, "we convene not to alarm, but to deliberate. The reports we have received, though incomplete, are troubling. Pallor, numbness, smooth patches across the hands and forearms, symptoms reminiscent of illnesses long considered eradicated." A murmur passed through the room. Dr. Whitcomb leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Reminiscent, yes," he replied, "but far too precise to be coincidence. The cases follow patterns too consistent for error, too exact for misdiagnosis. The disease is among us once more." Colchester shook his head sharply. "I am not convinced. The reports are anecdotal, incomplete, gathered by observers who may misinterpret symptoms or exaggerate for attention. Panic thrives on half-truths and whispered fears." Another physician, Dr. Henley, interjected, voice low but firm, "And yet we have corroboration from multiple districts: Stepney, Whitechapel, Spitalfields. The same signs, appearing independently, at approximately the same intervals. Are we to dismiss these observations? Colchester's jaw tightened. I am not dismissing them. I am advocating caution. There is a difference. To speak aloud, to declare publicly, invites hysteria. London cannot endure mass panic over a disease whose full nature remains uncertain. Whitcomb's eyes narrowed, the flicker of candlelight reflecting off his spectacles. And what of our duty to the afflicted? Shall we prioritize the city's comfort over the care of those suffering silently? These patients cannot speak for themselves. Their hands, their skin, betray them in ways words cannot. A silence fell over the room, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. Each man considered the implication of Whitcomb's words. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, softening the sounds of carriage wheels and footsteps, muting the city's usual clamour. It was as if London itself paused to listen, waiting for these learned men to reach consensus or to fail entirely. Colchester leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the faint gleam of the polished floorboards. Observation, then, he said at last. Controlled wards, isolation where necessary, record every detail. But public alarm must be avoided. Discretion is paramount. Whitcomb's lips pressed together, tight with frustration. Observation alone will not save them. Families are frightened, children vanish, markets falter, and fear spreads faster than medicine. If we delay too long, we are complicit in their suffering. Henley cleared his throat. Perhaps a middle ground, containment combined with careful communication to select households, might serve both ends. Colchester's expression remained rigid. Communication only to those essential for care. Beyond that, silence. We cannot let the city unravel in whispers. The debate lingered as the fog deepened outside. Lanterns flickered against the windows, casting long, wavering shadows across the desks and the faces of the men within. Each knew, with unspoken certainty, that London's invisible epidemic moved faster than legislation, faster than observation, faster even than the prudence that guided their every word. As the meeting adjourned, the physicians rose slowly, some muttering instructions, others lost in thought. They stepped into the fog-laden streets, lanterns swinging, coats pulled tight. The city awaited them, its narrow alleys, its busy markets, its hidden corners, all breathing silently under the weight of the pale hands moving unseen. The men disagreed, yes, but the disease needed no consensus. It advanced quietly, methodically, touching London's heart, and leaving whispers, shadows, and dread in its wake. Westminster Hall, once resonant with the clangor of debate and the measured rhythm of political deliberation, now felt subdued, as though the fog that pressed against London had seeped into its very stones. Gas lamps glimmered through the tall windows, faint against the pallid light of a winter afternoon. The chamber was filled with men whose authority was presumed, whose words usually shaped policy, but today their faces betrayed unease. The pallor of fear reflected faintly on skin that should have been flushed with purpose. The speaker called the assembly to order, but even his gavel seemed hesitant, the sound muted by the weight of a city already trembling beneath invisible hands. Reports from distant wards, boarding houses, and markets lay upon the desks in careful stacks. Each contained accounts of pale hands, numb skin, waxy texture, and individuals who no longer responded to pain or touch. Physicians' letters warned of a disease creeping quietly through London, a presence so subtle that only the most observant noticed its passage. Sir Reginald Hartwell, seated at the front, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen," he began, voice deliberate, "we face reports from Mile End, Whitechapel, Stepney, reports of a condition that we do not yet fully comprehend. Our physicians advise caution, yet the people are growing uneasy. Markets falter, households withdraw. Rumour spreads faster than reason. We cannot ignore these accounts." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some members leaned closer, whispering under their breath. Others adjusted their waistcoats, palms tightening around the edges of documents. Even the speaker glanced nervously toward the windows, as if expecting the fog to press through the glass and confront them with its secret. Lord Pembroke rose, hand pressed to a ledger of statistics. We must consider measures of containment. Isolation, observation, and controlled oversight are necessary. Yet there is danger in public acknowledgement. Panic can destabilize the city faster than any illness. Sir Reginald's lips pressed into a thin line. And yet the city will not remain ignorant forever. The pale hands are already moving through households, alleys, and wards. Children vanish from streets. Servants disappear from houses. Markets falter under whispered fear. Can we afford silence? Another member, Dr. Lawrence Fairchild, leaned forward, spectacles sliding slightly down his nose. We have seen this before: cholera, smallpox, typhus. London's history teaches that public knowledge, when measured carefully, allows preparation. But this disease behaves differently. It spreads silently, invisibly, leaving only traces and whispers. How does one prepare for something that touches without notice? The chamber fell into an uneasy silence. The fog pressed against the tall windows like living hands, curling inward as if to hear their deliberations more clearly. The men shifted in their seats, adjusting papers, muttering to aides, glancing at one another with an unspoken fear. The disease, though invisible, had already infiltrated the chamber's collective consciousness. Sir Reginald tapped the edge of a desk. We shall act with discretion. A committee shall oversee the collection of information and coordinate with the infirmaries. We must observe without alarming, contain without disclosure, and protect the city from its own terror. A young clerk, seated at the back, shivered slightly, recording every word. He noted the pale hands of the politicians, the sweat on knuckles, the subtle quiver of fingers pressed against ledgers. London's leaders, it seemed, were as susceptible to dread as any servant, any child, any laundress. As the session adjourned, members filed quietly from the chamber, coats drawn tight, gloves pressed to hands that had begun to tingle with apprehension. Outside, the fog thickened, curling along the streets, wrapping around homes, markets, and alleyways. The pale hands moved silently through the city, unseen, unannounced, yet always present. In Westminster, the Parliament of Pale Faces dispersed into the mist, unaware that their deliberations, their secrecy, and their careful control could not halt what had already touched every corner of London. The city, silent and trembling, awaited the next moment when whispers, shadows, and unseen fingers would determine the fate of its citizens. London had always been a city of crowded streets, bustling markets, and the endless hum of labor and commerce. But in the grip of fog and fear, the rhythm faltered. It was subtle at first. A hesitation in the marketplace, a glance over the shoulder in the alleyways, a door bolted that might otherwise have remained open. Then the quiet grew louder, heavier, until the city itself seemed to press inward, each inhabitant shrinking into suspicion, retreating from touch, from closeness, from the ordinary warmth of human connection. It began in the alleys of Whitechapel, where children once ran freely, tossing balls and chasing stray dogs. Now they paused at corners, peering nervously at one another, keeping hands tucked within their sleeves, eyes flicking toward doors and windows. Mothers pulled them close, whispering cautions they barely understood themselves, their fingers brushing pale cloth, imagining the disease moving invisibly between them. Even small gestures of affection, handshakes, pats on the shoulder, became acts of anxiety, as if touch itself carried the weight of life and death. In the markets, vendors hesitated to greet customers. Carts were left half-arranged, produce lay in uneven heaps. Shoppers avoided contact, clutching coins tightly in gloves, eyes scanning for signs they could not name. Rumors, whispered in quick breaths, traveled faster than footsteps. Pale hands, numb skin, waxy touch. Every bump, every accidental brush was magnified in importance. Panic did not yet roar, but it crept like a slow tide, moving from alley to street, household to household, unnoticed until it pressed against every door. Servants in boarding houses and private homes adjusted routines with obsessive care. Gloves were worn indoors at all times. Linens were handled with strict protocols. Surfaces were wiped, scrubbed, and disinfected repeatedly. Children were kept separate, their play carefully monitored, their hands washed constantly. No one spoke of the illness by name, yet everyone knew it in the colorless skin, the numb fingers, the soft whispers behind curtains. London had begun to turn inward, each household a fortress of suspicion, every neighbor a potential threat. Even the wealthier districts were not immune. Belgravia, Mayfair, Kensington all exhibited the subtle signs of anxiety. Ladies refused to allow maids into parlors without inspection. Gentlemen withdrew from handshakes. Families ate their meals apart, cautious of the invisible menace that might dwell in the hand of a stranger or the glove of a servant. Conversations became coded, polite, and wary. Each phrase measured for its potential to reveal knowledge or spark fear. And in the narrow streets of Stepney and Spitalfields, where the disease had first emerged, the effect was most pronounced. Families who once shared communal meals and alleys now moved quietly past each other, glancing briefly at neighbors, noting changes in the pallor of skin or the stiffness of fingers. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. Even the fog itself seemed to echo the tension, curling into alleyways and pressing against doorframes as though listening for secrets it might carry further. By evening, London had become a city of isolation. Neighbors mistrusted neighbors, families distrusted strangers. The very act of touch was suspect. Children no longer played freely. Shopkeepers avoided eye contact. Carriages passed in silence, and the fog thickened, hiding the movements of those who might carry the disease unseen. The city had turned on itself, not with anger, but with fear. Fear of the unseen, fear of what could not be named, fear of the pale hands that moved quietly among them. And in every alley, every home, every market stall, the city felt the weight of its own suspicion, a subtle, pervasive dread that would linger long after the fog had lifted. London, it seemed, had begun to protect itself not from the illness, but from itself. Every hand withdrawn, every glance averted, every door bolted, became part of a vast, invisible quarantine of the mind. And the disease, silent, unfeeling, and merciless, moved on, unnoticed, unstoppable, and unopposed. At the corner of a narrow lane in Holborn, a window glowed faintly against the fog-pressed brick. It was the second story of a modest house, its curtains drawn just enough to allow a sliver of light to escape, spilling across the wet cobblestones like a hesitant star. Within, a patient sat perched on the edge of a narrow bed, hands folded over a thin blanket, fingers pale and unfeeling, the skin smooth as ivory polished by some invisible hand. She had been brought to this room in secret, carried quietly past stairways and corridors, past floors scrubbed so thoroughly that the damp wood seemed almost sterile. The house itself had been chosen for its isolation, a quiet place where the disease could be observed without alarming neighbors or drawing attention. Outside, London moved obliviously, carriages rattled, footsteps echoed, vendors shouted, but inside the window, the city's pulse seemed suspended, as though time itself held its breath. The patient, a young laundress, shifted slightly, lifting her hands to the edge of the blanket. She flexed her fingers, but no sensation met her attempt. The skin remained smooth, pallid, and silent. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the window pane, tracking the fog curling along the street below. There was awareness in her gaze, but no comprehension of the disease that had claimed her hands. No understanding of the pattern. She had joined an invisible map traced across the city, connecting alleyways, boarding houses, markets, and wards. Nurse Hartley moved quietly behind her, adjusting pillows, smoothing the blankets, taking care not to touch the patient's skin. Each movement was deliberate, precise, careful, because the disease had taught them that caution alone was a form of protection. She whispered soft reassurances, though she knew the words could not reach the parts of the patient that had become numb. Silence, she realized, was often the only comfort. Across the street, the fog swallowed the sound of approaching footsteps. The patient did not hear them, but Nurse Hartley did. She glanced at the window, noting the way the light bent across the panes, casting reflections that seemed to shift like ghostly figures. The room itself felt smaller than it was, walls pressing inward, lamplight trembling in tandem with the patient's faint shiver. It was a chamber of observation, yes, but also of quiet terror, an intimate witness to the disease's invisible progression. The matron, Mrs. Brindle, entered softly, lantern in hand. She approached the bed and lowered herself to the patient's level, noting the subtle changes: the blush along the wrists, the faint stiffness in the elbows, the tremor in the hands as they rested upon the blanket. Every detail was recorded, catalogued, scrutinized. The patient's body was a ledger, every inch of skin a page upon which the disease wrote its silent history. Outside, the fog thickened, curling along the eaves of neighboring buildings, drifting across the street. Londoners walked beneath it unaware that the disease had already claimed hands, hearts, and homes, moving quietly from alley to alley, room to room. The window, though small, offered a view of the city's oblivion. From within, the patient stared into the grey veil, alone yet part of a larger network she could not perceive. Matron Brindle adjusted the lamp, the patient's face illuminated in pale warmth. "Rest now," she whispered. "You are not forgotten here." The patient's gaze returned to the street, following the invisible lines of the fog. She did not know the full reach of the disease, nor could she comprehend the pattern of fear it had drawn across London. Yet, in that silent room, she bore the weight of the city's unknown, a quiet witness in the window to a metropolis slowly learning the cost of its hidden terror. And as the fog pressed closer, curling around the house, twisting along the street, the patient remained in her window, unfeeling, unnoticed, and utterly alone, a pale sentinel at the edge of a city that could not yet name the disease moving silently among them. Fleet Street had long been the artery of London's information, where ink-stained fingers pressed type onto paper, where the rhythmic clatter of printing presses echoed like the heartbeat of the city itself. News travelled swiftly there, financial updates, political proclamations, gossip, scandal. Yet even this great thoroughfare, so accustomed to the hum of knowledge, could not anticipate the quiet menace that now threaded its alleys, offices, and houses. The pale hands, the waxen skin, the numbness that moved silently from person to person. The last case to reach the attention of the physicians stationed in the city came unexpectedly, carried by the clatter of hurried footsteps and whispered warnings. A clerk in a small office, formerly attentive and precise, had been discovered slumped at his desk. His gloves were still on, thin leather pressed tightly over hands that betrayed the disease's unmistakable mark. When removed, the pallor revealed itself fully, smooth, unfeeling, cold to the touch. His fingers, once nimble with ink and paper, remained inert, unresponsive to gentle pressure. Dr. Fenwick and Nurse Hartley were summoned immediately, moving quickly through the fog-laden streets that pressed around the city like a living thing. The clerk's office was narrow, lined with tall shelves and ledger books, the smell of ink and paper mingling with the damp chill that had infiltrated the room through partially open windows. The man's breathing was shallow, mechanical, almost imperceptible, as though he were merely a vessel for the disease that had claimed him. "Another one," Hartley whispered. gloved fingers hovering over the clerk's hand. She dared not touch it. The skin was smooth, wax-like, absent of the slightest sensation. How many now? Fenwick exhaled slowly. Too many to count, and the spread is no longer confined to the poor or the alleys. Offices, schools, households. Fleet Street is only the latest. He paused, hand pressed lightly against his own chest. We are running out of options. The clerk's eyes flickered briefly, recognizing movement, then settled into vacant awareness. He had long ceased to respond fully to pain or touch. The disease had claimed him quietly, utterly, leaving only the semblance of life in the hollow gaze of his pale face. Outside, the fog pressed harder, curling beneath the lamplight, winding along cobblestones and stairways, slipping into alleys and into the city's heartbeat. London continued its rhythm. Carts rattled, horses shied, vendors called faintly from distant stalls. Yet beneath it all, a subtle tension had gripped the thoroughfare, a collective awareness of unseen peril. Clerks moved with hesitation, doors were bolted more firmly, and hands gloved or not were kept from touching surfaces that might carry the invisible threat. Fenwick observed the clerk carefully, noting the progression of pallor from fingers to hands, from hands to wrists. The disease had learned to move quietly, deliberately, leaving only faint traces for those trained to see. He jotted each observation in his ledger, the ink capturing a record that would likely never satisfy the urgency of the moment. By evening, the clerk was removed to the quarantine house at Mile End, escorted through the fog by Fenwick and Hartley. The streets were nearly empty, and the city seemed to hold its breath as the small procession passed. A few citizens glanced from windows, puzzled, unaware of the significance of the figures moving silently through the mist. As the office lights dimmed and the shutters closed along Fleet Street, London exhaled. The disease had claimed another victim, leaving only the shadow of its presence behind. The clerks who remained returned to their work cautiously, gloved hands avoiding surfaces, eyes darting toward colleagues, whispering rumors into the thick air. The last case on Fleet Street was now history, catalogued in ink, observed in lantern light, and transported quietly into isolation. Yet beyond the walls, along every alley, street, and household, the pale hands continued to move silently through the city, indifferent to class, profession, or caution. London had seen its first wave of panic, and though the newspapers would not speak of it, though the public remained oblivious, the city itself had begun to learn the cost of ignoring the invisible menace threading quietly among its people. By the time the last reports trickled into the Royal College, London had already learned a hard, quiet lesson. Some truths cannot be ignored, but some must be forgotten, even as they linger. The streets, once bustling with the rhythm of life and commerce, had grown subdued. Alleyways and narrow passageways carried only the faintest echoes of footsteps. Markets reopened with a cautious, half-hearted cheer. Children returned to play, though their hands were washed, gloves worn, and eyes ever watchful. Yet the memory of what had passed the pale hands, the waxen skin, the numbness, was not spoken aloud. London had chosen to bury it, even as the traces remained in every corner of the city. The laundress from Stepney rested now, her pale hands folded quietly beneath a coarse blanket in the dim light of a distant ward. Nurse Hartley moved through the corridors, adjusting linens, noting temperatures, cataloguing progress. The quarantine house at Mile End remained full, its patients anonymous in their suffering, each one a silent ledger of the disease that had spread too far, too fast, to be entirely contained. The fog pressed against the windows, curling inward as though to witness the quiet continuity of the city's concealment. In Belgravia, Lady Evelina Harcourt sat in her drawing room, gloved hands folded in her lap. The letter she had sent to Dr. Fenwick weeks earlier had received a careful, measured reply. The patients were observed, the city reassured, and the story quietly sealed behind polite phrasing. The servants moved with precision, children played under watchful eyes, and the pallor that had appeared in Stepney was now a ghost in her consciousness, a memory she could neither fully acknowledge nor entirely forget. The newspapers on Fleet Street returned to their usual cadence of politics, commerce, and society gossip. No mention was made of pale hands, waxen skin, or numbness. Readers remained blissfully unaware, absorbing ink-stained pages, while London itself bore the weight of what it had chosen to hide. Printers and editors moved with normal efficiency, unaware that the disease had touched their own colleagues, their own families, their own hands, and that every manuscript, ledger, and document had been handled by fingers perhaps already pale, smooth, and silent. Even the churches observed a careful discretion. Bells tolled as they always had, marking hours and summoning worshippers, but no sermon spoke directly of the silent menace that had passed through the city. Reverend Whitcomb prayed privately, recording observations in journals no one would read for decades. Candles burned low in chapel windows, their light flickering across pews empty of the knowledge of fear, leaving the congregation with only the faintest awareness of absence. And yet, despite the city's collective choice to forget, the memory persisted. Alleyways still carried whispers of vanished families. Boarding houses held the faint smell of antiseptic and fear. Markets remembered the hurried departure of vendors and the faint smears left by pale hands. Children remembered, if only subconsciously, the way adults had moved cautiously, how gloves had been worn indoors, how hands had been avoided. In the wards and quiet rooms where patients rested, the disease continued its slow work. Observation, careful care, and containment could mitigate suffering, but they could not undo what had already passed through London's veins. The city had turned a deliberate eye away, refusing to name it, refusing to confront it fully. It would record nothing beyond the faintest hint in ledgers, letters, and whispered accounts. And so London moved on. Streets were polished, markets reopened, children played, and offices hummed with business as usual. The city had chosen propriety over acknowledgement, silence over reckoning, convenience over clarity. Yet the pale hands remained, moving quietly in alleys, resting unseen in boarding houses, and tracing faint, invisible paths across the lives they had touched. London refused to remember, but it would never forget. The fog, the whispers, the smooth, waxen skin, they lingered in the air, a subtle reminder that some truths cannot be fully erased. Some shadows, once cast, remain forever. And thus the city slept, uneasy and oblivious, beneath a blanket of fog that held secrets no one dared speak aloud.